When I was growing up, both of my parents were teachers, and now I do this. So I guess the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Specifically, my dad was a history teacher, and my school was so small that he was the only history teacher in the school. So yes, I took 2 years of history from my own dad. And being a history teacher, whenever we took trips, it was always to history-related places, old Spanish forts in South Texas and, abandoned mines in New Mexico and Colorado. Really boring stuff to a 10-year-old. But damn it, some of it rubbed off, because history topics are some of my favorite to cover on this channel. History is storytelling. It's the great story of humanity. It explains why the world is the way it is today. I can't tell you how many light bulb moments I've had putting together videos on history topics, because I was like, oh, that's why those two countries hate each other. So to start off this compilation of history videos, I'm going to go with what's really one of my favorite videos that I've ever made on this channel. Like, whenever people ask if there's a video that kind of changed my look on the world or the way I look at the world, I always refer to this video. And it's all about the spice trade. Okay. I know it's kind of gross when YouTubers flex about their lifestyles and whatnot, but I have something downstairs that's actually pretty impressive. Come here, let me just show you. Before I do this, I just want to remind you, I'm just a regular guy, I promise. I'm not like a billionaire, I'm not like the Prince of Brunei or something like that, but check this out. Huh? Okay. Obviously the gag here is that there's nothing all that impressive about my spice collection. In fact, it's basic AF, and I'd be surprised if half of them weren't past the expert. Oh, good Lord. But 400 or 500 years ago, all of these would have been a luxury. This collection would have been the envy of the most wealthy noblemen. People would have marveled at the world traveling that I must have done and asked about my bloodline and wondered what this weird, soft, colored metal must be. And probably hang me as a witch. Let's not go there. I mean, there's a lot of things about the way we live today that's totally different from the way our ancestors lived, but maybe none more radical than the way we treat spice. In fact, I'll make the argument that if you could point at one thing that most explains the world the way it is today, it would be spices. This thing that we completely take for granted today and just kind of pick up for a few bucks whenever we happen to be at the store, it used to be worth as much as gold. Men traversed the entire world trying to find it. It built and destroyed empires, enslaved millions, and created the most powerful corporation the world has ever seen. In fact, it kind of created the entire economic system that we all live under today. This video is about the history of spices and the world it created. How is it that something we pretty much all take for granted today was so insanely valuable hundreds of years ago? I mean, sure, the world has changed, technology's changed. It's not like they had iPhones back then or anything, but spice? I mean, I'm not even trying to make a Dune reference here, but for hundreds of years, humans went through extreme measures to make sure that the spice must flow. I want to be clear, spices weren't the only commodities being traded around the world, and trade didn't start with spice. People have been trading across empires and tribes for thousands of years. But spice was a huge part of this global trade network. And there are a few theories why. One theory is just that spices covered the taste of spoiled meat. Yeah, this was long before refrigeration, so again, something that we completely take for granted today was a major concern for people hundreds of years ago. So there you go, problem solved. There are a few problems with this theory. First of all, spice was expensive, like actually way more expensive than the meat that it's supposed to be saving. In fact, in medieval Europe, a pound of ginger could buy a whole sheep. That would be like putting your iPhone in rice to save the rice. The spoilers theory seems to come from a book by a food scientist named J.C. Drummond, and he based it on historical records that referred to green meat. But historians think that green was used in the sense of like fresh, like newly cut meat. Besides, in the old days, they had a different way of keeping meat fresh. They just kept it alive. Yeah, before refrigeration, shipping meat wasn't a thing. They shipped pigs, they shipped chickens and cows and goats and sheep. And then the end user would, do the dirty work. Like on sea voyages and caravans, they didn't, pack meat and stock up on meat and take that with them. They just brought the animals along. And then there was the added benefit that the animals could walk, so they had meat that carried itself. Also, meat was just a much smaller part of people's diets back then. Of course, not everybody could afford to have livestock or gardens, and they did have to take some efforts to prevent spoilage, but often this involved things like pickling or salting foods, so, if you consider salt to be a spice. Now, having said that, some spices do actually help prevent food spoilage because some spices are antibacterial and antifungal. And there's a reason for this. It's because spices are basically poison. Have you ever wondered why people who live in hotter climates tend to eat spicier foods? Yeah, there was a theory going around for a while that eating spicy foods kind of paradoxically makes you feel cooler because it activates your sweat glands, or it just kind of makes you feel cooler on the outside because your insides are on fire. And there could be some truth to that, but the general answer is a lot simpler. They eat hotter food there because that's where the spices grow. Most of the hotter spices, your peppers and chilies, they tend to grow along the equator where it never really gets cold and plants grow year-round. They don't have the luxury of a winter freeze that can kill off the bacteria and fungus and bugs that can attack and kill these plants, so they had to just sort of develop a chemical weapon system of sorts. In spices, it's capsaicin, and tobacco and coffee, it's nicotine and caffeine. But that kind of gets to the heart of this whole thing, right? The climate in these specific areas cause plants to create chemicals that make us feel things. Could one make the argument that the spice trade was really the first drug trade? Only if one wants to be demonetized. Of course, many spices and teas were used medicinally because of their antibacterial properties. Of course, they didn't have the germ theory of medicine back then, so they didn't know why it worked, they just knew that it worked. It was also used ritualistically. The ancient Romans would burn it as incense, and Egyptians actually used cinnamon to help preserve their mummies. Think about that the next time you're choking down a cinnabon. But maybe when it came down to it, spices were a flex. Kind of like what I was doing at the beginning of this video. Especially in Europe, spices were exotic. They came from faraway places, and they were expensive. In a way, they were the ultimate status symbol. Gold and jewelry are nice, but what better way to show off how cool you are than to serve your guests a food that they had literally never tasted before? Oh, this is Moroccan? Wow. So what's your story? This is actually true of a lot of foods. Pineapples are a good example of this. Sailors and travelers would bring pineapples home from more tropical places, and they would just serve it to everybody in these giant parties. And eventually pineapples kind of just became a symbol of hospitality, and there would be, representations of them up on hotels and stuff like that. Actually, it's a fascinating history, but that's for another time. But yeah, like pineapples, like the tulip craze that came later on, spices took on a value that were way beyond their practical use. They were valuable because they were valuable. They were like NFTs that you could eat. They were a symbol of wealth and high status in Europe. Combine that with their medicinal and practical uses, and I haven't even mentioned yet, they make food taste good. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but food holds a powerful place in our cultures and traditions. Think about how many holidays have specific foods attached to them, and how emotional we get about having those foods on those holidays. Those tastes that we're so emotionally attached to are made by the flavorings and spices that go into them, and once upon a time, those spices were only grown in certain parts of the world. So join me on a journey through the history of spice. Was that overdramatic? Too much? Went too far? Okay. One of the first known spice routes was well established by the 3rd century BC. Known as the incense route, it ran from India to Africa with stops along the way. One of those stops was the city of Petra in modern-day Jordan. Here they traded everything from Indian textiles to rare African woods, along with pearls, precious stones, gold, and incenses like frankincense and myrrh. Petra is also where Indiana Jones would later punch some Nazis in the Last Crusade. Petra, of course, is right down the road from Bethlehem, which is why the fabled 3 kings from the Bible came bearing gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And, if you're anything like me when you were a kid, you probably made jokes like, Mr. Myrrh over here needs to step it up. Some guy over here's got gold, or Mr. Gold over here is overcompensating for something, But the fact of the matter is, frankincense and myrrh were as valuable as gold back then. Another hub was Alexandria. Today, Alexandria is mostly known for its wonders of the world, like the Lighthouse of Alexandria and the Library of Alexandria. Well, something had to pay for these wonders, and that thing was spices. Boats would sail from India around the Arabian Peninsula and up the Red Sea into the Gulf of Suez, where they eventually couldn't sail any further. This was long before the Suez Canal, but there were roads that would carry goods and transport them to the Mediterranean Sea in caravans. And this is where Alexander the Great saw an opportunity. So he built his grand port city through which goods could be spread throughout the entire Mediterranean. And because of this strategic positioning, Alexandria became one of the most powerful and richest cities in the world. Apparently, trade was so lucrative there in Alexandria, the mint couldn't stamp coins fast enough for the currency exchange. A much more famous trade route later on was the Silk Road, which wasn't just a road, it was actually several trade routes, but they didn't just move silk, also spices. And jade, glass, furs, and slaves, but also spices. And technologies. Paper and gunpowder are both invented in China, but found their way into Europe on the Silk Road. Great explorers traveled the Silk Road like Marco Polo and Ibn Battuta, who wrote vivid accounts of their journeys. Often these were the first exposures that their readers back home would ever have to these cultures and the ideas that came with those cultures. And one of the major port hubs along the Silk Road was Constantinople, and it was founded pretty much for the same reason Alexandria was. It's situated on the Bosphorus Strait, connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, and just like Alexander the Great saw an opportunity to control shipping across the Mediterranean into Europe and created Alexandria, the Byzantine Emperor Constantine saw the same opportunity, so he created Constantinople. Tiny egos in these guys. But he was right. Constantinople became a powerful port city, and eventually when the Roman Empire split in two, it became the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, and actually survived long after Rome itself fell into ruin. The Silk Road was an incredibly successful and durable network that flowed spice across Europe and Asia for 1,500 years. And Constantinople was just one of dozens of cities that sprang up along the Silk Road from Turkey to China and India, many of which still exist to this day, and many others that have been lost to time, like the aforementioned Petra. Of course, you won't find Constantinople on the map today, but it's still there. It's just called Istanbul. Istanbul was Constantinople now. You know the song. Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, who changed the name to Istanbul to be more Islamic, because Constantine was a Christian emperor. And this was way more than just an interesting quirk of history and geography. This changed everything for Europe, because they were now in control of the spice. And they wielded that power, restricting the supply and raising prices. Yeah, that whole stereotype of Arabs being shrewd and ruthless traders, that's where it comes from. All right, so it's the late 1400s and Europe is suffering from spice withdrawal. So they decide it's time to just kind of go straight to the source. This time by bypassing the Middle East by going all the way around Africa. Sea routes have been a part of the Silk Road for a while, but nobody had ever actually sailed all the way around Africa before. And this is when Portugal said, hold my Sagres. Portugal had been a seafaring powerhouse in Europe for a while, again, because of geography. Their location at the tip of the Iberian Peninsula gave them equal access to the Mediterranean and the North and Baltic Seas, where actually another trading route existed across Scandinavia and Russia called the Volga route. This route was mostly controlled by Dutch merchants who partnered with the Portuguese. So if any country had the skill and resources to go around Africa, it was the Portuguese. So in 1488, Bartholomew Dias did just that, creating a new trade route directly to India. But this was not an easy trip. The seas around the southern point of Africa are notoriously treacherous, with violent storms and massive swells. So of course they named this the Cape of Good Hope. They also found that sailing south along the African coast was especially hard because there was a northward current along the coast that sort of slowed things down to a crawl. You're basically swimming upstream. They later figured out that the current was created by the South Atlantic Gyre, and it was actually faster to sail westward a bit and let the current carry you around to the tip of Africa. But still, this was a ridiculously long voyage that made it more expensive and also more dangerous, so still not a great option. Which is why, in 1492, Christopher Columbus thought he could do better by just, sailing west. Yes, the New World was discovered in an attempt to find spices. And gold. And yes, they knew the world was round, that's why he went that way. He thought that he could sail all the way around to India. It's also why he named the islands that he discovered the West Indies, and named the natives who lived there Indians, a name that has stuck to this very day. Columbus sailed for Spain, of course, and they continued to explore and exploit the resources of the New World, including gold and silver, and, of course, chilies and allspice. They also conquered native peoples and populated wide swaths of territory, which is why much of Central and South America speak Spanish. Meanwhile, Portugal continued going around Africa, because that's where their spice was, but remember how I said that they learned to sail west to take advantage of the South Atlantic Gyre? Well, in 1500, one of them went a little too far west. His name was Pedro Alvarez Cabral, and on his journey they had a small navigational error and accidentally landed in South America. He figured while he was there he might as well claim that for Portugal, which is why, unlike the rest of South America, Brazil speaks Portuguese. But cut back to the Spanish, they did trade in spices from the New World, but their main cash crop was sugar, which was harvested through the enslavement of Native Americans and West Africans. You know, sugar and spice and everything horrible. Okay, so I don't want to go too much into slavery here because it is a whole thing. But while slavery has been around as far back as we have records, the actual transatlantic slave trade that we all think of when we think of slavery, that began with Portugal sailing down the west coast of Africa and realizing, hey, here's a whole continent full of slaves. It actually started with them purchasing slaves from tribal leaders already in Africa, but as other European nations came on board, it just spiraled into kidnapping and conquest. Ultimately, tens of millions of Africans were shipped over to mostly Central and South America and the Caribbean to work in the sugar fields where conditions were so bad that the average life expectancy was 7 years. So they had to keep them coming. Slavery, of course, made its way out to North America, which caused all kinds of problems, including the economic disparity that we're seeing today. And it all started with Portuguese traders trying to find a new spice route. So throughout the 1500s, Spain got super powerful off their New World exploits to the point that in 1580, when Portugal experienced a crisis in succession in their royal family, King Philip of Spain swooped in and took over Portugal. And their first order of business was to cut the Dutch out of that lucrative deal with the Portuguese. Yeah, the Dutch kind of had their own thing going on this whole time, basically serving as trade facilitators for Northern Europe, with the Volga route coming in over land and the Portuguese ships feeding them goods from the Indies. They had become exceedingly wealthy, so wealthy in fact that when this Portuguese deal ished the bed, they just came up with a new solution. And being the shrewd merchants that they were, it was a decidedly capitalist solution. They created the world's first publicly traded company. They basically just invented the entire concept of a corporation. For spice. This allowed the public at large to invest in literal trade wars. And it was so based on spice that dividends were often paid in mace or cloves. Again, it kind of helps to think of spice as a currency. This was the birth of the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or the VOC, also known as the Dutch East India Company. And yet, these guys had no chill. They immediately set their sights on a chain of islands in modern-day Indonesia that were so rich in spices like cloves, mace, and nutmeg, they were known as the Spice Islands. The Portuguese had tried to trade with the natives earlier, but were met with hostility. So when the VOC arrived in 1605, they came with a massive fleet of ships and quickly took over an old Portuguese fort. Their early successes brought on more investors, and by the 1620s, the VOC had conquered parts of India, Indonesia, Southern Africa, and both North and South America. They held monopolies on the Spice Islands, all the trade routes between Africa and India, and they were the world's largest supplier of silver, copper, silk, porcelain, cotton, and textiles. They were not only the richest company, arguably in human history, they had the largest military in the world at the time, with over 30,000 troops and more than 200 warships. Okay, once again, just a reminder, this was not a country. This was a company. Oh, and they weren't alone. The British had their own East India Company, or EIC, and these two companies fought each other with wars. And I'm not talking about like cola wars between Coke and Pepsi. No, I'm talking about firing cannonballs at wooden ships filled with human beings. This was the birth of capitalism. Oh, and by the way, the EIC was a massive company itself and would eventually spread British influence to all 7 continents. But they couldn't hold a candle to the power of the VOC, and nowhere was that proven more true than in the Spice Islands. The Spice Islands were actually a chain called the Banda Islands, and the natives of these islands were called the Bandanese. And at the time, this was the only place in the world where nutmeg grew. How valuable was nutmeg? It was selling at the Venice markets for the same price per pound as gold. And the VOC was obsessed with getting a monopoly on this gold. So they literally slaughtered and displaced the entire civilization of Bandanese people in 1620. But one last crazy fact about the VOC, like I said, they were obsessed with having a total monopoly on nutmeg, so much so that there was only one tiny island in the Banda chain called Rand that the British owned, and there was nutmeg that was grown there. And they had to have it. So they cut a deal with the British to literally trade islands. The British gave them the island of Rand, and in return the Dutch gave them a small island off the coast of North America where the Dutch had a small settlement. That Dutch settlement was called New Amsterdam. The British changed its name to New York.
Even old New York was...
The Dutch traded it for the island of Rand! By the way, I don't think it's a coincidence that a city founded by the hyper-capitalist Dutch would go on to become one of the biggest financial centers in the world. In so many ways, the world that we live in today was shaped by spices. And the fact of the matter is, the spice trade never really ended. In fact, there's more spices going around the world right now than ever before. Most of it exported out of China. Although the Netherlands is still the world's 3rd biggest exporter and 2nd biggest importer of spices. And they ruled the Banda Islands, and all of Indonesia for that matter, until 1949. But globalization increased the supply and made it possible to grow in more places, which is why now you can go into a grocery store and get pretty much any spice you want for fairly cheap. Except saffron. Saffron's always expensive. You know, we always ask, like, what would people from the past think of our modern day today? And we think of that in terms of technology. And sure, they would probably be blown away by our technology and be really confused by it. But I'm starting to think that the cheapness and availability of spice might be the biggest mind blower for them. I mean, it's about the same as having grocery store shelves lined with gold bars. Now, this video is obviously an oversimplification of a very complex story throughout human history, but you know, I gotta say, it was really interesting to me when I started researching all this and I realized that, like, holy crap, it was about spice all along. But anyway, I hope that was interesting for you, and I don't know, maybe made you think a little bit about, you know, what we value today and why we value it, and how future generations might take it completely for granted. All right, that's it for now. You guys go out there and have an eye-opening week, stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. So that was the deadliest company in human history. Now I want to talk about the coolest company in human history, Henson Shaving. That sounds like a stretch. You may be saying, well, stretching is good for you. Keeps you nimble. Now, Henson's been a great sponsor to work with, so if you like this channel, allow me to sing their praises for just a minute. Shaving! It's a thing you gotta do over and over again. It's just a part of life that some companies have monetized to within an inch of its life. Charging you up to $4 each for these disposable cartridge blades, and they are not getting cheaper. But Henson is a company that's flipping that on its head by going old school with modern technology. See, back in the day, your grandpa used to shave with a safety razor, right? And it just used one double-sided blade that cost next to nothing, because he wasn't no sucker. So Henson has taken what your grandpa used to use and applied their unique expertise to bring it into the 2020s. What was that unique expertise? Aerospace engineering. Yeah, they run a machining shop that works with aerospace companies. They've made parts for the ISS and planetary rovers, so they work with pretty precise measurements. So they made a razor that supports the blade up to 27 microns, reducing the room for injury and ensuring the blade doesn't skip across the skin. And it holds the blade at a perfect 30-degree angle. 30 degrees has been proven to be the ideal angle to cut the hair as clean as possible. They're made out of aerospace-grade aluminum and titanium, easy to clean, last forever, and the best part is, the blades that it works with, they only cost 10 cents each. $4 each, 10 cents. And the best part is, if you buy a razor at hensonshaving.com, throw a box of 100 blades in your basket, just use the code SHAVINGWITHJOE when you check out, you'll get those blades for free. 100 of these blades could cost up to $400. $0. You're saving money right off the bat, people. So look, I love Henson. I've been shaving with this for a few years now, and I don't see myself going back. I think you'll like it too. Link down below. All right, let's keep this train moving by going way back on a video that actually required me to hire a banjo player. As some of you know, I grew up in a really small town, and in high school I worked at the grocery store. Which grocery store, you might be wondering? The grocery store. The one grocery store. You know, living in a small town, you kind of know everybody by face at least, so whenever somebody came in that you didn't know or had never seen before, that was kind of a big deal. And there was this one family that came in regularly, you know, husband, wife, daughter. They were very poor, had dirty, torn clothes, and they all had sort of an eye thing. You know that Forrest Whitaker eye thing where one eye kind of droops, you know that thing? Well, they all had that thing. All of them. I never caught their names. The only thing that the dad ever said to me was Copenhagen. But it was generally known around the store that they were kind of, yeah. But I don't know, maybe I can't judge, because I actually went back to my hometown early this summer for a cousin's wedding. Was my cousin the bride or groom, you may be wondering? Both. Both the bride and groom were cousins of mine. Now, in fairness, one of them was more of a second cousin, and they weren't like cousins related to each other. Like, one was a cousin on my dad's side, and one was on my mom's side. So it was only really weird to me and my sister, but still, yeah, it was weird. And to be even more honest, the first girl that I, went with in school was actually the cousin of a guy who married my cousin, whose son was the guy who married my other cousin earlier this year. The fact of the matter is, in many locations, in many situations, intermarriage is just a thing that happens. And it's usually not a problem in most cases, but in very isolated cases over a long period of time, it can lead to problems. And in extreme cases, it can lead to an all-out genetic catastrophe. So here's a look at some of the most inbred people of all time. Look, inbreeding happens. And in isolated cases, it's not the worst thing in the world. There's really more of a stigma to it than there should be. But in some cases, it is the worst thing in the world. While researching this topic, I found plenty of cases of incest cults and sexual abuse that are just disturbing enough to make your skin crawl. And I chose to leave those out of this because, frankly, it made me sad. But if you really want to learn more about cases like the Goalers in Canada and the Colts in Australia and others, I'll put links to that down in the description. Sickos. So on that note, let's start by getting our terms right. So inbreeding is the breeding or reproduction of animals or people over multiple generations. Incest is the act of two closely related people getting extra close. Now, the word incest is often used interchangeably with a type of sexual abuse, and let's face it, those two things unfortunately do go together way too often. But in the case of two consensual adults, it's weird, but not necessarily illegal. Although there are various laws across different states that prohibit marriage amongst blood relatives specifically to, avoid inbreeding. But it's not like if you marry somebody that just happens to be a second cousin that you'll have kids with eyes in the back of their knees or something. But you do run more of a risk of recessive traits being expressed. Now this is pretty basic genetics. We all carry dominant and recessive genes, and the recessive genes only get expressed if both parents carry that recessive gene, which is why sometimes you have two brown-headed people who wind up having a red-headed kid. And the more people with that same recessive gene intermingle, the more that gene is going to show up. Now if you're talking about red hair, obviously that's not a big deal. If you're talking about hemophilia, or any number of congenital disorders, it is a big deal. Which is why over time, with a lot of familial buggery, you run into some problems. And here are a few examples of those problems. The Blue Fugates of Kentucky. Ruth Pendergrass was a nurse in Hazard County in 1960 when a woman walked in with blue skin. Blue lips, blue fingernails, blue everything. Now normally this could mean that a person was oxygen deprived, but after they did some tests on her, they found out that she was perfectly healthy outside of a minor cold, which is what brought her in there in the first place. She was really perplexed by this, so she started looking into it, and that's when she discovered the legend of the Blue Fugates of Troublesome Creek. It all began with Martin Fugate, who immigrated from France in the 1820s and married Elizabeth Smith and settled down in the hills of Kentucky. And by some amazing coincidence, both of them carried the extremely rare recessive gene for blue skin, and 4 of their 7 children came out blue. And the part of Kentucky where they settled was seriously isolated. They didn't even get a railroad there until 1910. So the family intermarried, starting with their son, who married his mother's sister. This continued for over 200 years, and the more this went on, the bluer they got. And the bluer they got, the more they felt ostracized by the wider community, so they kind of retreated even further into the hills, which led to more inbreeding. Over time, they became a bit of like local lore, the blue hillbillies that lived in the woods, kind of like Bigfoot, until around the 1960s when some of them tried to integrate back into society. And it was then that a couple of the younger Fugates, Patrick and Rachel, reached out to the University of Kentucky Medical School trying to find some kind of cure. They were incredibly embarrassed about their skin color and they didn't want to be ostracized anymore. So after doing some tests and research, they found out that the Blue Fugates carried something called methemoglobin, which is a non-functional blue version of our regular hemoglobin that carries oxygen in our cells. Now, hemoglobin is what makes our blood red, and it's the reason why people with a lighter complexion have a little bit of a pinkish hue to them, because it's that blood color coming through their skin. And one of my favorite little factoids is that when you're doing color correction for video and film, which I've done plenty of in my time, the skin tone that you correct for is actually the same no matter how dark the pigment is in a person's skin, because you're actually correcting for the blood that flows underneath, and the blood underneath is the same in all of us. I always like that. There's just a little bit of kumbaya-ness to that fact. Luckily for the Fugates, there was a solution to their problem, and it was, ironically, to add more blue. Methylene blue dye, for some reason, causes the body to turn methemoglobin into regular hemoglobin. So they gave this to Patrick and Rachel, and apparently their skin color changed to normal right before their eyes in minutes. That might be the most X-Men shit I've ever heard of. With a daily dose of this blue dye, the Fugates have been able to reintegrate into society. Go science. Allentown, New York. In the foothills of the Adirondacks in New York State, there lies a tiny community that's called Allentown, though the people who live there just call it the Hollow. And the reason it's called Allentown is because pretty much everybody there comes from one of 2 families, the larger of which is the Allens. These families have lived in almost total isolation for 200 years, living as subsistence farmers and trappers, with no police or fire department, and no problem marrying their siblings. Now, due to the nature of this mountainous region, which is typical for a lot of these types of communities, these people were already pretty isolated for a long time, but it was when a dam was formed that flooded the Sacandaga Valley that they really got cut off. Most of the farmers in the area left for greener pastures, literally, but the Allen and Catherine family stuck around because they refused to leave their ancestral home. Now, following that in the 1930s, the Depression shut down a lot of the mills that were employment opportunities for a lot of the people in that area, so they just kind of like became even further isolated. Stories of abuse and incest among the families ran rampant in the surrounding communities, and infighting became so bad that it got to the point where the people of Allentown built a wall around their town, like some kind of medieval village. It wasn't until the 70s and 80s that social workers started to make inroads into the community, and what they found were houses with dirt floors, no AC, no heating, no running water. They used fire pits for warmth, basically just people living in primitive conditions. And they actually called in a local anthropology professor to come in and sort of study these people like they were some kind of uncontacted tribe. The people of the town refused any outside help at first, but eventually kind of warmed up and allowed the social workers to come in and weatherize their homes and introduce them to some modern comforts. The people of Allentown say that the stories of incest were overblown, but they do acknowledge that pretty much everybody there is related, so it's kind of impossible to avoid at least a little bit of inbreeding. A film was made in 1975 documenting the people of the area called The Hollow. I'll link to it in the description below. It's enlightening. The Habsburg dynasty. Some people intermarry because that's just their only option. Others do it because they're just better than everybody else. Royal families in Europe were notorious for inbreeding because marriage was one of the ways that they secured alliances amongst their empires, and there were only so many royal families to go around, so eventually you're gonna bang a cousin. But the Habsburgs took this policy to a whole other level. The House of Habsburg ruled states in and around the Holy Roman Empire in Eastern Europe from 1526 all the way up to 1918 when World War I kind of put the kibosh on all that imperial stuff. But one segment of the Habsburgs married into the Castile region of Spain, so they became known as the Spanish Habsburgs. It was Philip I who married Joanna of Castile in 1946, which put the Habsburgs on the throne in Spain, and they decided they didn't want somebody else to come in and do their trick and marry in and take the throne out from under them, so to avoid that, they just married each other for over 200 years. This constant intermarrying produced a litany of deformities and health problems, which led to more than half of the Habsburg children dying before the age of 10. And the most visible physical defect amongst the Habsburgs was a protruding jaw, also known as a mandibular prognathism. This became so prevalent amongst that family that it actually became known as the Habsburg jaw. And it wasn't just that this was unattractive, it actually caused a problem, like some of them had trouble speaking and even eating. And this condition actually affected the most famous member of the Habsburg family, Marie Antoinette. Although it didn't affect her very seriously, it basically had the effect of making her lower lip pooch out a little bit, which they said gave her the effect of always having something of a pout. But all that inbreeding came to an end with the birth of Charles II in 1665. He was the son of Philip IV, who married his sister's daughter, making him Charles's father and great-uncle. Charles's jaw was so pronounced that he couldn't fully close his mouth, meaning that he drooled everywhere, and his tongue was so oversized that he couldn't speak until the age of 8. And he couldn't walk until he was 4 years old. He was weak, had chronic intestinal problems, and was impotent. Thank God. He also went a little bit crazy later in life when he insisted that his servants go dig up his ancestors so that he could have dinner with them, like you do. Stories about how inbred he was were so pervasive that when he died in the year 1700, stories began to circulate about his autopsy, claiming that he didn't have a drop of blood in his body, that his head was full of water, and that his testicles were black. Now, none of that was probably true, but he was so messed up that most people believed it. Charles II died without an heir, which led to the War of Spanish Succession that lasted for 13 years, finally putting an end to the Habsburg rule and all the incest that came with it. King Tutankhamun. The discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922 was one of the most amazing archaeological finds of all time. The Egyptians buried their pharaohs with lavish displays of wealth, so most of their tombs were raided long ago and looted by fortune hunters, but this was one of those super rare tombs that was actually unopened. Now, before this discovery, Tutankhamun was a relatively unknown pharaoh. He was only 18 when he died. His reign was, unremarkable by most accounts, and it only lasted about a decade, but his tomb provided more information about ancient Egypt than any other discovery in history. But when his body was examined and later his DNA tested, it revealed more than we ever bargained for, because the Egyptian royal family was super inbred. Now keep in mind, the pharaohs were considered living gods. So while the Habsburgs intermarried each other in order to retain power, the ancient Egyptians believed that a normal person wasn't even allowed to touch a pharaoh lest you be smited by the gods. So they just hooked up with each other. And this went on for millennia. Tutankhamun's father, Akhenaten, married his own sister, a practice that had been going on for hundreds of generations before, which is why Tutankhamun suffered from numerous genetic conditions, including a cleft palate, a massive overbite, fused vertebrae, and a club foot, which required the use of a cane. And even at such a young age, Tutankhamun practiced incest himself. He was married at age 8 or 9 to his wife, Ankhesenamun, who had previously been married to her own father. And found in Tutankhamun's tomb were 2 mummified fetuses that were believed to be stillbirths from that marriage. Now, you could say the royal family was in pretty bad shape at this point, but this still went on through various dynasties for another 1,300 years. Isn't it amazing that for the majority of human history, the people who were in charge, the people who called the shots, were the most genetically inferior people on the planet? I mean, the fact that we managed to get this far is pretty stunning. So hey, with all the problems we've got going on in our world today, at least we don't have that problem. All right, thanks again for watching. Now you guys go out, have an eye-opening rest of the week. I'll see you on Monday. Love you guys. Take care. How often do you drink soda? Be honest. Once a week? Once a day? All the time? Whatever your answer, just stop it. Just stop drinking sodas. It's really bad for you. Or is it? No, don't do that. Do what? That thing where you talk about a topic and you set up an expectation that you're going to say one thing and then you turn around and you say something else just so that everybody's like, oh, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I never thought of it like that. He's such an interesting guy. Or is he? No, there is no other side to this argument. Hundreds of studies have linked sodas to obesity and weight gain, diabetes, even strokes. Or do they? Yes, they do. Not to even mention hormone spikes, teeth problems. The number one thing that anybody can do to improve their health is to cut out sodas. Or is it? This bit's run its course, hasn't it? Yeah. Or has it? In all seriousness, soda is kind of terrible for you. So if you are one of these all-day, everyday drinkers, I would encourage you to, just throw a little water in there. Just saying. Ironically though, soda was originally considered to be a health drink, containing essential sugars for them and vigor. Carbonated water was first introduced in the 18th century, and at the time they thought that it had healing properties that could cure a variety of ailments. So the first soda shops were actually in pharmacies, and they'd mix medicines into the drinks. For instance, you might order a lemon-lime lithium citrate or a caffeine and cocaine concoction. And nobody would have blinked, because at the time, cocaine was perfectly legal, and in fact, they felt it had beneficial properties. And it does, to a point. The cocaine alkaloid was first isolated from coca leaves in 1859 by Albert Nyman, and even though its commercial potential was debatable, doctors at the time embraced it. You could get cocaine drops for toothaches or cocaine throat lozenges. It was even used as an anesthetic by dentists and surgeons. Sigmund Freud, the famous psychoanalyst, used cocaine and promoted it as a cure for depression and sexual impotence. He also became super addicted to it, and it took him 12 years to break his habit. Cocaine can be found in all sorts of elixirs and tonics in the late 1800s and early 1900s, but there was one beverage that stood out above the rest. The authors Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Jules Verne drank it, Pope Leo XIII carried it in a flask, even the US Presidents Grant and McKinley were fans. It was said to give you energy, strength, vitality, and wings. And that last one's something else, actually. What we're talking about here is Vin Mariani. What is Vin Mariani, you may be asking? Well, it's a combination of cocaine and wine. It's literally cocaine mixed with wine. Because who has time to drink wine and snort cocaine? That's just too much work. You like cocaine, you like wine, but doing both at the same time is hard. There's got to be a better way. Now there's Vin Mariani, wine with an extra kick of cocaine. Now you can have your Coke and drink it too. Perfect for weddings, retirement parties, funerals, bar mitzvahs, loitering, threatening people in clown costumes, breaking into your whore ex-wife's house to get your dog back, and much more. Vin Mariani, get lit today! It was invented in 1863 by a Parisian chemist named Angelo Mariani, and it's basically 6 milligrams of cocaine per fluid ounce of red Bordeaux wine. Damn, son. And they actually recommended drinking 3 glasses of this a day, basically drinking a glass with every meal. But before you guys start thinking these guys were completely crazy, just know, they only recommended half that amount for children. Now, Timmy, be careful not to spill your wine and cocaine juice. Vin Mariani was so popular, it spawned a whole slew of copycat mixtures, including one by an Atlanta pharmacist named John Stith Pemberton. He was trying to find an alternative to the morphine and heroin-based concoctions that were out there, which were totally a thing and super popular at the time. But he found one that combined the extracts of the coca leaves and the cola nut. He called it Pemberton's French wine coca and claimed it was even better than Vin Mariani, even saying that, quote, "it was a most wonderful invigorator of sexual organs," unquote. An effect that's shared by Vin Mariani and your mom. But Pemberton ran into a problem with his wannabe Spanish fly in 1886 when Atlanta passed a prohibition against alcohol, making his drink illegal. Not because of its cocaine, because of its alcohol. Because of this, he replaced the wine with sugar syrup and he renamed his concoction Coca-Cola, the temperance drink. This drink became so popular that it spurred a number of knockoffs, including Cafe Coca, Wyzeola, and my favorite, Celery Cola. Celery Cola. I can just imagine the taste of cola syrup mixed with nothingness. So how much cocaine was actually in Coca-Cola? Well, it's kind of impossible to say in the early days, but by 1902, it was down to like 1/400th of a grain of cocaine per fluid ounce of cola syrup. So, I mean, you know, it's not like a lot of cocaine. But even that was becoming problematic because cocaine addiction was quickly becoming an issue in the United States at the time. This kind of mirrors our current day opium crisis because they put cocaine in everything, basically overprescribed it, and then lo and behold, people got hooked on it. By 1912, the US recorded approximately 5,000 cocaine-related deaths. The drug became related with a loss of morality in the culture, and lawmakers started pushing for it to be outlawed, which they did with the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914, which basically regulated and taxed any extracts from coca leaves or opium plants and essentially put an end to cocaine being in Coca-Cola. But like a lot of things that happened in that time in American history, they made some room for a little bit of old-timey racism. African Americans and laborers in general were associated with cocaine because their employers would give them cocaine to make them more productive on the job. So this went way back. But when Coca-Cola was bottled in 1899, that was the first time that African Americans could really drink it because up to that point it was only sold in pharmacies and most of those were segregated. So of course, once it was available, they rushed out and bought it, which of course only played into that association that was already there between African Americans and cocaine, and this narrative began to form that there was this explosion of drug use among African Americans. To the point that in 1910, a U.S. State Department official, Dr. Hamilton Wright, said, quote, "The use of cocaine by the Negroes of the South is one of the most elusive and troublesome questions which confront the enforcement of the law," unquote. So yeah, that's some stay out the Woolworths racism there. It's also kind of par for the course in those days. This right here was a Klan rally held in 1925 in Washington, D.C. 30,000 Klan members showed up and marched on Washington, and nobody blinked an eye. Hell, 10 years later, the American Nazi Party held a rally and filled Madison Square Garden. They were a little more racist back then. But due to the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, as well as the Jones-Miller Act of 1922, cocaine use kind of fell off to the wayside, kind of became an underground thing for a while, and then, well, the 80s happened. The economy was rising, people wanted to party, and cocaine started flowing into the country from all over the world, and the price of cocaine dropped by as much as 80%. So the suppliers had to get creative and find new and cheaper ways of selling cocaine, and what they landed on was crack, which is basically cocaine mixed with baking soda and water. And it sold for as much as like $5 for a crack rock in 1985, and it became really popular in lower income communities. Popular is a weird word to use there, actually. It was a scourge. It decimated poor urban neighborhoods.
See this cute little vial here? It's crack, rock cocaine, the most addictive form.
It isn't glamorous or cool or kid stuff.
But the government's response to this has been highly controversial ever since then. It only compounded the problems in those neighborhoods. They passed a law called the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, and amongst a lot of other stuff that was in this bill, one of them was that it differentiated the sentences between cocaine and cocaine-based drugs. Lighter sentences for regular cocaine, heavier sentences for crack. In other words, if you got caught with a little baggie of cocaine, your sentence would be a lot lighter than somebody who was caught with a couple of rocks of crack, even though the amount of cocaine in crack is far lighter than that in regular cocaine because it's mixed with other stuff. And this flooded the prison system with low-income and minority prisoners. So Yeah, controversial. But there is some good news. The Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 was passed to sort of ameliorate these differences, and now if you get caught with crack, your sentence is only 18 times worse than regular cocaine. So, progress. With methamphetamines and the opioid crisis getting all the headlines, you don't really hear as much about cocaine anymore, but it is still the second most popular drug in the United States, although that popularity is waning. According to the RAND population, spending on cocaine in the United States has dropped from $58 billion in 2006 to $24 billion in 2016. But maybe that's because we're drinking so much caffeine we don't really need it anymore. 80% of adults in the Western world consume caffeine in one form or another, from coffee to tea to the endless brands of energy drinks, also known as Kyle juice. And people are vaping so much nicotine they're starting to die from it. Also known as Kyle juice. So maybe it just turns out that one way or another, people are just gonna want a little bit of a boost. People gonna people. But as they say, the dosage makes the poison. So does it make sense to decriminalize cocaine in small amounts? I mean, the number of people that died when cocaine was in Coca-Cola was far less than what happened in the 80s during the crack epidemic. Some countries like Colombia, Mexico, and Peru have decriminalized small amounts of cocaine and haven't seen any real substantial problems from it. In fact, Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001 and saw a huge decrease in drug overdoses, as well as HIV infections and drug-related crime. For something like that to happen in the US, though, it would take a massive shift in public opinion. A 2016 poll showed that 76% of Americans opposed decriminalizing cocaine. But who would have thought 20 years ago that marijuana would be legal in half the states in the United States? So, who knows? So I guess now if you want to try a Vin Mariani, maybe someday you'll get a chance to. Or an original Coca-Cola. But not New Coke. Never New Coke. Alright, thanks you guys so much for watching. I've had a lot of people ask about, whether or not Coke actually had Coke in it back in the day, and I just thought it was an interesting subject because a lot of the stuff that today is just like verboten and you couldn't imagine actually being able to go out and get it just used to be in everything. It's just crazy. Real quick though, I want to give a shout out to some people that I really have not paid enough attention to and given enough love to on here, and that's the members of this channel. So YouTube does have memberships now. If you look below the video, there's a little button that says join. If you ever wonder what that means, that's what it is. Right now it's about $5 a month. You can join and you can get free early access to videos. You get access to exclusive live streams that are only for Patreon and members. And there's about 100 people right now that are on there, and I have not thanked you guys enough. I really do appreciate it. And if you are interested, just click that join button down below. Right now it's only $5. That's the only tier that's available. There are going to be more coming soon that's going to look a lot more like Patreon. But anyway, if you're interested in supporting the channel but don't like the idea of Patreon or anything like that, this might be a good option for you. Just click down below and see what it does. Like always, please do like and share this video if you liked it, and if this is your first time here, check out this video. Google thinks you'll like that, or any of the others down the side. And if you like the cut of my jib, you like the kind of stuff I cover, please do subscribe. I come back with videos every Monday and every Thursday. And that'll be it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week, and I'll see you on Monday. Love you guys. Take care. Be honest, if you could buy some Vin Marinari right now, would you do it? Tweak smarter, not harder, people. So we don't have Vinnie Mars on our new merch site. I think cocaine's still illegal. I'll look into that. But let me take a second and tell you what we do have on our new merch site. It's called laughsmarter.com. We got shirts, like the one I'm wearing right now, and they're soft. Do you like a soft shirt? Because these are like super soft. They make our old shirts feel like they were made out of burlap. We also have some new designs with newer ones coming out all the time, and limited merch drops that you can only get for a limited time, including our current merch drop, which are these 3D printed Roman dodecahedrons, so you can get your hands on one and maybe help figure out what exactly these things were used for. This, of course, goes back to my dodecahedron video that just came out a few weeks back, so time is kind of running out on these. So if you want to get your hands on one and have a nice little desk bobble or Roman fidget spinner, it is kind of fun to do that. You better go get it now because they're about to go off. Anyway, we worked really hard on this site over the last year, and we're really proud of it. And buying from this site does directly support the channel in probably the best way possible. So if you have gone and checked it out, thank you for doing so. And if you haven't, links down below. Okay, so moving on, I did go through a bit of a Victorian rabbit hole a while back on the channel. I just became super fascinated by the Victorian period. It's such a weird time in history where we had learned just enough about science to be dangerous, but not enough to do things that made any sense. So yeah, a lot of crazy happened all at once. Things like this. So recently I did a video on Spring Heel Jack, which is considered the first urban legend. And in that video I spent a little bit of time talking about Victorian London because it was sort of that time and place that set all the things up that made something like Spring Heel Jack happen. But here's the thing, the bit about Victorian London was actually just a small chunk of what was originally in the script because, you know, I just had to cut it for time so I can get to the Spring Heel Jack stuff. But you know, that's the nature of writing. Sometimes you gotta kill your babies. But I didn't kill it completely. I set it aside for a future video. I put it in a coma. But I did that because I find the Victorian era absolutely fascinating. I've totally fallen down a Victorian era rabbit hole. It's just the cultural norms at the time, the way people lived, the new technological innovations and discoveries that they were all just kind of figuring out. It just all created a very weird time. So today I'm going to dust off some of the stuff from that previous video and talk about a few different ways that the Victorian era was utter insanity. What we think of as the Victorian age began on June 20th, 1837, with the coronation of Queen Victoria, and it ended with her death at the beginning of 1901. So basically most of the 1800s. It's mostly associated with the United Kingdom because obviously she was the queen there, but it also corresponds to a lot of stuff that was going on in the United States at the time because we're culturally similar. But also this was a time period when the sun didn't set on the British Empire, so Victorianism spread pretty far and wide. And this was a time of incredible change. New discoveries and technical innovations not just changed the way we saw the world, it changed every facet of our lives, from medicine, to transportation, to fashion. So the Victorians were kind of caught between the old world and the new. And this mixing of old school superstitions and scientific advancement led to some idiosyncratic cultural norms that seem baffling today. So while the title of this video says 5 reasons, it's kind of 5 categories of reasons. There's actually a lot, so let's just get into it. Number 1. Their homes were death traps. Okay, so Victorian interior design was really big on wallpaper. Big, colorful designs covering every inch of the walls, especially in their entertaining rooms like their parlors and dens where people would meet and gather. It was supposed to start conversations. Respected artists would actually create wallpaper patterns, and then the rich and elites would like clamor to get them and be the first to show them off in their homes. And green was an especially popular color because it was kind of brand new. Green in the past had been particularly difficult to get just right. It usually came out kind of dull and it faded really quickly. But in 1775, a Swedish chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele created a new type of green that became known as Scheele's green. And it was a big success because it was super rich and vibrant, and most importantly, it stayed that way. And with the advancements of industrialization in the Victorian era, wallpaper got down to a price where the middle class could afford it, so Scheele's green found its way into thousands of homes around Britain. The problem was one of the chemicals that he used to make this particular shade of green was arsenic. Arsenic that would flake off and get inhaled or ingested, or it might just find its way into the vapor that was created from the glue evaporating off the wall. And for a while, it kind of seemed like a mystery illness. People would complain of pain in their throats, closing up, difficulty swallowing, abdominal pain, diarrhea, vomiting, and then they just died. And unfortunately, these symptoms are very similar to cholera, which was rampant through London at the time, so that made it particularly hard to diagnose. But they did eventually catch on, and then next thing you know, there are stories all over London of people buying wallpaper and then dying a few months later, and believe it or not, this made it less popular. So arsenic would eventually get phased out of this green color, but arsenic wasn't the only thing that you could find in paint. There was also lead. Lead was used in all kinds of paint at the time, especially high-gloss wood paint, so it would find its way into doors and walls, and also kids' toys. Lead poisoning could cause anemia, leading to sort of a gray pallor and a loss of energy. It would also cause mental problems and a loss of IQ in children. And in extreme cases, it caused what were called Burton's lines, which is sort of a bluish-greenish line that would occur on the gum line and underneath the tongue. There's no way to know how many people suffered from lead poisoning. It may have just kind of been part of life at the time. Maybe that's why people look so sad all the time. Or maybe they were sad because their homes kept catching on fire. The Victorians were first to introduce gas lines into their homes for heating and cooking and lighting the room with gas lamps, but like any new technology, there were hiccups. Hiccups like gas fires, homes exploding, and sometimes people just asphyxiating in their homes. Later on, electricity found its way into homes and electric light bulbs, which many of the old people were not fans of.
Such a glare. I couldn't have electricity in the house. I wouldn't sleep a wink.
But similarly, electrical fires were common. People got electrocuted a lot because, yeah, new technology. But maybe the biggest death trap in Victorian homes was also seemingly the most innocuous, and that's baby bottles. Yes, baby bottles were introduced during this time, which was kind of a big deal because a proper Victorian woman did not breastfeed. Expose my bosom in private? What am I, an animal? That job was handed off to wet nurses. These are women whose job it was to kind of keep the milk flowing for the aristocratic ladies of the day. They were professional breasts, basically. But then baby bottles came along and did away with all that, because now Victorian mothers could feed their children themselves without the indignity of their nipples seeing the light of day. But the bottles used stoppers made out of cork and rubber, both of which were very porous and provided a place for bacteria to hide in. This bacteria would then get into the unpasteurized milk, the babies would drink it, and a lot of them got sick. Thousands died. Today, of course, we know all about sanitizing baby bottles, but the reason that we know to do that is because they didn't. And we saw what happened. The infant mortality rate in general was insanely high. Like, if you've ever wondered why they had so many kids back then, they would all have dozens of kids, it's because 60% of kids in the working class died before the age of 5. Every child born back then was basically a flip of the coin. They might make it or they might not, so parents didn't really get attached to their kids that much. And one way that they did that, which I find utterly fascinating, is that they kind of didn't assign genders to the kids. Like, they basically treated every kid like it was a girl with dresses and long hair. And this was partly out of practicality, so that they could use the same clothes over and over again. They wouldn't grow out of the dresses quite as fast as they would grow out of pants. But also, it was a way to sort of detach from the kids. Like, why invest in this kid's individuality if there's a 50% chance they're not gonna make it? For example, this picture right here, this kid, that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1884 when he was 2 years old. Boys were dressed like this until about the age of 7, when they were put in pants for the first time. Pants were called breeches at the time, so this was known as breeching. And they would even hold breeching parties to mark the occasion. It was like somewhere between a bar mitzvah and a gender reveal party. And in a way, it was kind of a celebration that this child made it, you know, that this particular coin flip landed on heads and they didn't die like so many of the others. And maybe because there was so much death around. Number 2, they were obsessed with death. It's been said that the Victorians were professional mourners, and a lot of that came from Queen Victoria herself. Her husband, Prince Albert, died in 1861 at only 42 years old, and this devastated her. She never fully recovered. She went into mourning and stayed in mourning for the next 40 years. And many people in Britain joined her, especially the aristocracy. It was kind of considered unseemly to stop mourning before the Queen did, so they just kept mourning along with her. They all wore black, and then that style of wearing black kind of filtered down to the rest of the population. Although I did hear that one of the reasons people wore black was because the soot in the smog of London was so thick that it would get on people's clothes, so they wore black because it didn't show up as badly on black. But anyway, yeah, with so much death on their mind, maybe it's not too much of a surprise that when photography became a thing, one of the first things that they pointed their cameras at was dead people. It was a type of something called a memento mori, or a reminder of death. And this is something that goes way back, but the Victorians were super into it because of course they were. But postmortem photographs became really popular because they were really expensive at the time, and so people didn't usually get their photographs taken. And then when somebody died, it was like, well, here's your last chance. And for parents who lost kids, that was often the only photo they ever got of them. Considering there was a 60% mortality rate, that's a lot of pictures of dead kids. Now, one thing about photography at the time was that the exposure time on these cameras was really long, up to 1.5 minutes, and so it was almost impossible to not move a little bit during that time, so most of the pictures were blurry. It was also pretty much impossible to get a baby to sit still for that long, so most of the clear pictures of babies were dead babies. In fact, early photographers had stands that they would put their subjects' heads on so that they wouldn't move during the shot. But in many of these post-mortem pics where the family members posed with the dead loved one, you can tell which one is the dead one because they're the ones that are not blurry whatsoever. It's super creepy. Oh, and one example of a memento mori was the long canoe thing that I mentioned in a previous video. Which, by the way, I know I'm mispronouncing it, just go with me. Long Canoe was a young girl whose body was found on the side of the River Seine in Paris, and they made a death mask of her, and this death mask became like a really popular item in Victorian homes. They bought them up like crazy. It was everywhere. Yeah, I'll put the link to the previous video down below because it's a super fascinating story, and Michael Jackson shows up in it at one point. But it's just sort of another one of those weird macabre trends that were really popular in the Victorian era. They also had a lot of superstitions around death. Like, a lot. Like, any minor random thing could mean that your time was up. They saw doom in everything. Just some of them include, if a firefly gets into your house, someone will die soon. If you smell roses when none are around, somebody's gonna die. If you see an owl in the daytime, somebody will die. If a sparrow lands on a piano, someone in the home will die. If a picture falls off the wall, someone you know will die. Opening an umbrella in the house means someone will be murdered there. If a bird pecks on your window or crashes into one, that means someone has died. And if there's a death in your house, you're supposed to stop the clock at the time of the death or you'll die yourself. Pray and cover all the mirrors in the house to prevent the dead person's spirit from hiding there, and of course the next reflection seen in the mirror will be the next person to die. The body needs to be removed from the house feet first to prevent the spirit from looking back and beckoning another family member to follow. And after the funeral procession has left the house, it's bad luck to lock the door. If you see a funeral procession in the street, you're supposed to turn your back because facing it is bad luck. But if you can't turn around, you can hold onto a button. That'll fix it. And if a dog howls at night while someone in the house is sick, that's a bad omen. It can be reversed, though, by reaching under the bed and turning over a shoe. Obviously. Number 3. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. That, of course, was the famous line to Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, which was actually set during the French Revolution, but the term Dickensian became sort of synonymous with poverty in the Victorian era because of books like Oliver Twist. As I talked about in my Spring Heel Jack video, Victorians were just obsessed with class structures, to the point that, like, if you were in a lower class and you tried to even talk to somebody in the upper class, you could be arrested or fined for that. Social mobility wasn't really a thing. Whatever class you were born into, you pretty much died in. If you were poor, you pretty much died poor, unless you were lucky enough to have somebody in the upper class kind of take you in and mentor you. But this was super rare. The reality for most poor people was living in squalid slums, working long hours in dangerous factories for pennies a day. Yet the life expectancy for tradesmen at the beginning of the Victorian era was 25 years old. For laborers, it was 22. Luckily, there were no child labor laws, so you could start employing somebody as young as 4, which they were popular in mines and chimney sweeps because they could fit into places where adults couldn't. And yeah, if one of your parents died or were sent off to a debtor's prison, the kids had to go to work so that they could, provide food for the rest of their siblings. And if a kid lost both of his parents, he had the option of going to one of the famously nightmarish orphanages or joining a gang of pickpockets that roamed the streets of London, of which there were many. And for the adults that had no place to live, you could go to work at one of the Victorian workhouses where you could work for up to 12 hours a day in basically indentured servitude. In the beginning, they were almost a good idea. They provided shelter and employment for people that didn't have any other place to go, but as industrialization sort of took over, they began running these for profit, and it basically became a form of slavery. Now, there were some efforts made to alleviate the suffering of the homeless and destitute, especially considering the brutal London winters. So, like, say, if you wanted to get out of the elements, you could go to what's called a penny sit-up, where you paid a penny and basically got to sit on a bench for the rest of the night. Though you weren't supposed to sleep there. They actually had monitors that would walk through and kind of tap your skull if you fell asleep, because that did not come with the price of admission. For that, you could pony up another penny and sleep on a 2-penny hangover. This was literally a rope that you hung over. And you could sleep there if you wanted to, if you could manage to sleep like that, but by morning time, the staff would literally come around and just cut the rope and send everybody crashing to the floor. Don't gotta go home, but you can't stay here. But if you were lucky enough to have a few more pennies, you could go to a 4-penny coffin. These were homeless shelters with rows of wooden boxes that you could sleep in, hence the name. Yeah, this sounds terrible, but it's a big step up from hanging over a rope, and plus a lot of these places would provide blankets and sometimes even tea and bread. Like you're a human being or something. But if you were lucky and you survived to an old age, you could get a job as a garden hermit. Yeah, those ceramic gnomes that people like to put around their yards? That used to be an actual job. This actually started in the century before the Victorian era, but yeah, like rich people with palatial gardens would basically build a little hermit house. They called it a hermitage, and they would pay an old man to live there and dress him as a gnome or a druid. Keep in mind, these weren't like the groundskeepers. They didn't actually do anything usually. They just lived there. According to an advertisement reference in 1797, quote, "The hermit is never to leave the place or hold conversation with anyone for 7 years, during which he is neither to wash himself or clean himself in any way whatever, but is to let his hair and nails both on hands and feet grow as long as nature will permit them." Again, this predated Victorian times, but it was definitely carried on by Victorian aristocrats. I do declare, you're just nobody unless you have a crazy old homeless man living in your backyard. Number 4, they drank their own sewage. Yeah, one of the biggest technological innovations during the Victorian era was indoor plumbing, specifically toilets. This obviously revolutionized how many people lived, but for a while there, it kind of made everybody sicker. Because London's sewer system at the time was still pretty medieval, and it was dominated by trenches and waterways that had been built centuries before. The most recent update was from the 17th century, where they basically just covered up the Fleet and Walbrook rivers and then just used those as sewers. Keep in mind, this was 200 years prior. But with the population boom that was going on in London, and now there's all this toilet water flooding into everything, it was just bursting at the seams. And it overflowed into the Thames. The Thames, of course, is the river that London was built around, Father Thames, as it was called. It was the way people got in and out of town, it was how they imported and exported things, and it was their drinking water. So yeah, there was sewage in their drinking water. And this led to cholera outbreak after cholera outbreak in 1832, 1848, and 1853 that killed tens of thousands of people. And all the while, the river was getting more and more polluted and disgusting. Even legendary scientist Michael Faraday lobbied to do something about it. But the problem is they didn't associate the cholera outbreaks with the sewage in the river. Because at the time, they believed in the miasma theory of disease spreading. They believed that the spread of disease was caused by an invisible miasma in the air. Basically, they thought that the smell of the water was more dangerous than the water itself. So instead of actually treating the problem in the water, they just tried to cover up the smell. But there was one doctor who thought there was a better answer, and his name was John Snow. Fine.
You know nothing, Jon Snow.
Except this John Snow actually knew something. Why do I do this? During the cholera outbreak of 1848, he noticed that the death rates were higher in the areas where the water was provided by two companies. And he published a paper that suggested that it was the water supply spreading the disease, which went against the current thinking of the day. And this paper changed nothing. Nobody listened to him. When cholera broke out again in 1854, Snow noticed a cluster of deaths on Broad Street in Soho, where people used a communal water pump. So he removed the handle of the pump so nobody could use it, just to run a test. I'm sure the people living on Broad Street didn't really appreciate having to go somewhere else to find their water, but the deaths stopped. And when they investigated the water source, they found out that it was right next to a cesspool that had a crack in the brick, and the cesspool was getting into that water supply. Again, he published his results. Again, he was ignored. I mean, the scientific community was starting to come around on germ theory as opposed to miasma theory, but miasma theory is what the general public had been going off of for a long time, and this nerd wasn't going to change that. It's like, imagine if some scientist today claimed that the germ theory of medicine was wrong and that disease was actually caused by, like, fluctuations in the quantum field or something. We'd all be like, what? So the river's getting worse and worse, cholera outbreaks left and right, and the population was growing, and still nothing was being done about this. And then 1858 happened. June of 1858 was an especially hot month, and that, combined with some droughts upriver, caused the Thames to evaporate. As the water level went down, the concentration of sewage went up, and the embankments of the Thames became caked with tons and tons of human waste. Actually, not just human waste, but also animal waste, industrial waste, dead animals, dead fish, all washing up on the side and just putrefying in the sun. The smell from literally hundreds of years of human waste just is probably as bad as you can possibly imagine. I mean, it spread all over London, but especially down in the city center, right off the Thames, it was almost impossible to breathe. It became known as the Great Stink of 1858, and at long last, something was finally done about this problem. And you know why? Because this building right here, that's the Houses of Parliament. And you see that water right next to it? That's the Thames. The lawmakers in Parliament literally had to attend meetings holding handkerchiefs to their faces. And again, they were mostly trying to cover up the smells, so they put what was called chloride of lime on their draperies. That was kind of an old folk remedy to get the miasma out of the air. When that didn't work, they just dumped it right into the river, which only made it more toxic. Finally realizing that there was no way around it, they passed a bill through in 18 days, which was a record at the time. They allocated £3 million to this project, which would be around £4 billion today, and they assigned it to a civil engineer named Joseph Bazalgette. This was one of the biggest public works projects in human history. They built 1,100 miles of oversized sewers to accommodate for the growing population, and it worked so well, it's still in use in London today. And after the new sewer system was complete, London never had another cholera outbreak again. So Jon Snow was proven right, and the miasma theory faded into history. And number 5, they believed there was life on the moon. Briefly. Most of the stories in this video relate to Britain more than the United States, but this one is definitely a US thing. On August 21st of 1835, an article appeared in the New York Sun, which was a very brand new newspaper at the time. It was only a couple of years old, but it referenced something that was published in the Edinburgh Journal of Science, which was a very respected scientific journal at the time. The article is about a new discovery by Sir John Herschel. Now, if that name sounds familiar, you might recognize William Herschel, who was John Herschel's father. William Herschel discovered Uranus, and the Herschel Space Telescope was named after him. So yeah, his father was a legend of science, but John Herschel had some accomplishments of his own. For one thing, he was an early photography pioneer. He actually created several of the different processes that were done in the early days of photography. In fact, he coined the term photography. He was also a respected astronomer. He discovered several galaxies, was the president of the Royal Astronomical Society 3 different times, and in 1883 he took a research trip to South Africa to catalog the southern sky, and it was there that he saw the eruption of Eta Carinae, which now looks like this 190 years later. Anyway, it was one of the discoveries on that trip that this article in the New York Sun was about, and that discovery was life on the moon. Not just life, but a whole civilization of different types of creatures, including giant birds, unicorns, tailless beavers that stood as tall as humans, one-horned buffalo, furry-tailed giraffes, and a race of fur-covered winged humans building temples across the moon's surface. He even named the species Vespertilio Homo. Yeah, that means Batman. And apparently he was able to see all this stuff where other people couldn't because he was using a telescope, an immense telescope of an entirely new principle, as it was saying in the Sun. So this was actually a series of 6 articles that appeared over the next couple of months, and the public went crazy for it. It was super popular, not only in the US, it went wild all around the world. Sales of the New York Sun went through the roof, and they quickly became one of the most popular newspapers in the country. You know, this was the early days of mass communication. Thanks to the telegram, things could spread all around the world faster than ever before. This was kind of the first thing to ever go viral. This was a time of new scientific discoveries. Every other week there was some new groundbreaking technology, electricity, galvanism, steam engines, and now one of the most respected astronomers of all time is saying that there is a civilization of Batmen on the moon. Yeah, astute scientific observers of this channel probably have already figured this out, but it wasn't true. It was all made up. After the 6th article was posted, the Sun admitted that the whole thing was a hoax, just an entertainment to sell newspapers, and it definitely did that. And believe it or not, people weren't even mad about it. They all just kind of accepted it as the joke that it was and laughed along with it. In fact, the Sun printed some lithographs of illustrations of what these creatures might look like, and people bought them up in droves. Yeah, even John Herschel appreciated the joke. At first. Yeah, apparently 10 years later, after being asked for the 5 millionth time about the moon people, he didn't think it was so funny anymore. So in 1840, a reporter named Richard Adams Locke came out as the author of these articles, and he claimed to have done it, well, to sell newspapers, obviously, but also to sort of satirize some of the more outlandish scientific claims of the day. One example from 1824 was a professor at Munich University who claimed to have found evidence of a civilization on the moon in his paper titled "Discovery of Many Distinct Traces of Lunar Inhabitants, Especially of One of Their Colossal Buildings." Another person he was apparently satirizing was Reverend Thomas Dick, who had computed that the solar system contained 21.9 trillion inhabitants, including 4.2 billion on the moon. This whole event became known as the Great Moon Hoax of 1835, and it's considered by many to be the greatest hoax of all time. So yeah, during a time of technological revolution, specifically communication technology, a media company published fake articles in order to make money. This sounds familiar. And I think maybe this is why I'm so fascinated with this time period, because there are a lot of parallels between now and then. I mean, again, we think of today as a time of massive change, but look at how life was before and after the Victorian period. Like I mentioned toilets earlier, before the Victorian age, people did their business in bedpans and bathed in washtubs in their bedrooms. The Victorians created the entire concept of a bathroom. There was an entire industry around ice because that was the only way to keep food from spoiling. By the end, electric refrigeration was common. Travel was basically something only rich people could do, and the fastest you could get anywhere was by horse. By 1900s, trains spanned continents and there were cars on the road. Interior lighting was only done by candlelight and oil lamps. Kitchens were basically rooms built around a wood-fired oven or stove that you had to keep feeding with fuel. So much of life before gas stoves was arranged around storing and preparing food. Afterward, it was just a thing you scheduled into your day. And think about music. For all of human history before the invention of sound recording, the only way to experience music was to be physically in front of somebody playing it. So fancy houses had parlor rooms arranged around pianos, and it was important for somebody in the house to be able to play music for family entertainment and when guests came over. But then once Victrolas came out, parlors were centered around them. They were like the first entertainment center. So much of how we live today and how we understand the world got its start in the Victorian era. Everything changed on a very fundamental level. So all this crazy that happened during the Victorian era, it was basically the birth pangs of the industrial world. And now today we're experiencing a new technological revolution that's changing everything about how we live and work. I mean, like, look at what I'm doing, YouTuber. That as a job is only like barely over a decade old. We are in a period of transition, just like the Victorian age. And let's be honest with ourselves, it's getting kind of weird. kids eating Tide Pods for fake internet points, people eating sheep dewormer for a disease that we have a vaccine for. I'm pretty sure people in the future are going to look back at this time period with a giant WTF as well. You know, just like the Victorian era was the birth pangs of the industrialized world, maybe we're currently experiencing the birth pangs of the information world. But hey, at least we're not drinking our own poop. Thank you guys for watching. Now go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week, stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. Told you there was going to be another one. So last month I did a video about the Victorian era and how it was utter insanity, and I wasn't really sure how it was going to do. It was a bit of a departure for this channel, just a little rabbit hole that I had fallen down that I thought was really interesting. I didn't know if anybody else would care about it, but yeah, it turns out it did pretty well. Turns out you guys are freaks too. But like I said in this video, there was actually a ton of stuff that I cut out of that video and saved for yet another video, which is kind of unfortunate because the stuff that I cut out is actually some of the more salacious stuff I ran across. Because this focuses mostly on the health and beauty fads that the Victorians got into, and yeah, if you think that the way they decorated their homes was crazy, just wait till you see what they did with their own bodies. One of the biggest takeaways from the last video was that the Victorian era was a period of transition, where old ways collided with new ways to produce a very interesting time. And one of the places where that becomes the most obvious is in their understanding of disease. You know, in some ways they were improving their knowledge by leaps and bounds, but with new knowledge requires an understanding of how to implement that knowledge, which they did not have at all. And because of that, number one, their medicine was completely insane. Have you ever heard anybody say that they know just enough about something to be dangerous? Yeah, that was the entire medical field during the Victorian era. I talked about this a little bit in my video about John Harvey Kellogg, which is definitely worth a watch if you haven't seen it. But yeah, medicine in the Victorian age, the late 1800s or so, was very much a throw stuff at the wall and see what sticks approach. Yeah, that's the one where I talk about the doctor that had a cure for male infertility, where he implanted goat testicles into guys' scrotums. It's a real thing that happened. So the germ theory medicine was pretty much brand new, but they still didn't really have ways of combating it. Antibiotics were still quite a ways off. But they had figured out how to extract drugs from plants that makes you feel better. So they did that. A lot. And from that you get things like cocaine toothache drops, which you could buy over the counter. Cocaine was actually in a lot of stuff back then. Again, did a whole video on that. I feel like I'm going to reference a lot of my old videos in this. I seem to go back to this well quite a bit, because they were insane. It was an insane time period. And one of the most popular items of the day, for parents anyway, was Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup. It was something that they gave to kids who couldn't sleep or were teething. And the reason it was so popular is because it worked. Within a few minutes of giving this to a kid, they were calm and quiet, laid out. It was like a miracle. I'm sorry, did I say miracle? I meant morphine. It was morphine. Yeah, you know how in Saving Private Ryan, when the medic knew that a soldier wasn't going to make it, he would basically euthanize him by injecting a bunch of morphine into him? Yeah, it was that. For kids. Okay, I'm exaggerating a little, but it was morphine! Now similarly, if you're a lady of the day and you're dealing with painful menstrual cramps and whatnot, the Pond's Tampon Company has just the thing for you, because they dip their tampons in opium and belladonna extract. Belladonna, also known as deadly nightshade, because it's poisonous. But it does cause muscles to relax, so the opium would get rid of the pain and the belladonna would cause the muscles to stop cramping. So yeah, I mean, it was almost a good idea. Actually, I'm sure it worked wonders in the short term, but for the long term, I mean, well, there's a reason you don't see them on the shelves today. Now, one thing that Victorian doctors were really into at the time was phrenology, which was the idea that the shape of your head determined what kind of person you were and what kind of health you had. They had maps of the human head with various areas dedicated to different personality traits, and it was thought if your skull had bumps along those spots, that it was an indicator of what kind of person you were. This was especially used to determine criminality. It was thought that they could tell by the shape of your skull whether you had inherent criminal traits, and they would actually use this to put some people in asylums. In fact, the guy who invented mugshots first started doing it as a way to sort of figure out certain facial characteristics that were common amongst criminals. The idea being that if you could figure out these common traits, then police could, arrest people before they commit crimes. It was only later that they realized that it was helpful in identifying repeat offenders, so they kept doing it. And, as I've talked about before, body snatching was big at the time. Yet donating your body to science wasn't really a thing back then, so medical schools kind of relied on grave robbers to go and dig people out of graves that were fresh in the ground. Which is why you sometimes see old graves with like iron bars around them. It wasn't to prevent vampires from coming up, or zombies as some people say. It was to keep grave robbers from getting into the graves. But perhaps the craziest health fad occurred right at the end of the Victorian age when radioactivity was discovered in 1896. They discovered what it was, but they didn't know that it caused cancer. And the way they found out that it caused cancer was because they put it in everything. You know, they saw this natural energy coming out of rocks, so surely if you put that in your body, it would give you vim and vigor. So yeah, they put radium in makeup, thorium in toothpaste. You could take radium in pills, you could drink it in a drink called Radithor, and if you want a real kick out of it, you can drink it out of a uranium glass. Yeah, girls working with radium in factories started getting sick, the famous radium girls I've talked about before, and people that were drinking that Radithor began to notice that it was starting to eat through their jawbones, and in the case of amateur golfer Eben Byers, his jaw fell off. This is an actual guy who drank 3 bottles of Radithor a day for years. Probably wasn't the glow he was going for. Now this was about a decade or so after the Victorian era would officially end, but Victorians, they sacrificed a lot for beauty as well. Number 2, they did some crazy stuff to look good. Today, if you were to come home to find your lady friend standing in front of you in a corset and lace stockings and high heels, friend, you better put that chalupa down because she's got other plans. In the Victorian age, that would have been Tuesday. Victorian women wore corsets all the time, sometimes even in their sleep, in an attempt to cinch their waist down as small as possible. Now this is still done today, don't get me wrong, there's whole communities of people that are into this kind of thing, and that's cool, do you, but the Victorians took it to extremes. They were obsessed with it. Like, this is where that whole thing about women fainting because they get surprised came from. The idea being that they were so cinched in that their blood pressure would jump when, you know, their heart rate increased and they would pass out. It's debated still whether or not this was really a thing, but it's talked about. But yeah, to the Victorians, there was nothing more important than having a tiny waist, which they would exaggerate by putting a bustle underneath their dress. More on crazy fashion stuff later. But yeah, something else that they were really into was having a doe-eyed look. To go along with their ant waists. And so what they would do to create a doe-eyed look was, going back to that old belladonna, they would put belladonna juice in their eyes. But I feel the need to reiterate that belladonna is poisonous, and many women went blind doing this. They'd also apparently put lemon and orange juice in their eyes because they thought that the sting meant that it was cleaning their eyes when it was actually the acid eating away at their corneas. They also really valued pale skin. The whiter the better, because that was associated with wealth, because if you didn't have a lot of money and you had to work, then you would probably be working outside, the sun would beat down on you and darken your skin. But if you were wealthy, you didn't have to work. You could just, you know, sit on the couch in your living room eating bonbons with your pale ass. So soaps often promised to whiten your skin. They would use white makeup, but if you were really dedicated to that pale life, you'd eat arsenic complexion wafers. Yes, arsenic, the thing that wound up in their wallpapers I talked about in the last video, killed thousands of them. Well, they also openly consumed it in arsenic complexion wafers, the idea being that in low doses, arsenic can limit your body's ability to produce red blood cells. You know, like a dying person. But less red blood cells under the skin meant paler skin, because we all know anemia is the sexiest disease. These extreme beauty hacks are of course mostly aimed at women, but if you feel sorry for the women of the age right now, just wait. It gets worse. Number 3, women had it rough. Okay, so I talked a second ago about the corset craze of the Victorian era. It turns out that's actually a pretty good metaphor because women were pretty squeezed for options during that day. I'm sure it's a surprise to nobody to know that the women of the Victorian era had fewer rights than they do today, but just to give an idea of how controlled they were, consider Annette Kellerman. She was an Australian actress who got arrested in the early 1900s for going to a beach in an inappropriately revealing outfit. Oh my God, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that was, I hope this doesn't get demonetized. But seriously, women in the Victorian era were expected to be in full skirts and pantaloons at the beach, and you could only remove the skirt when you were in waist-up water, and then you had to put it back on before you got out, and in the meantime, I guess you just held on to it? But in fact, many beaches provided little changing rooms on wheels that they called bathing machines, where you'd get in on the beach fully dressed, they'd wheel you out into the water, you would change clothes on the way, and then you could exit on the other side and swim in privacy. Which is especially funny when you consider that most of the beaches were segregated by gender, like men weren't even allowed on the same beach as the women, whatever. But sexually they were crazy repressed back then, both the men and the women, but especially the women. Like, sex was only supposed to be for procreation. Even for married couples, you were not supposed to enjoy it. It was considered unseemly and whorish for a woman to enjoy sex, even with her husband. In fact, they believed that women couldn't have orgasms. And pretty much any kind of female unhappiness was labeled hysteria, and the doctors had a way of relieving this hysteria. It was called a pelvic massage. Again, I covered this in a previous video, but a pelvic massage was where a doctor would have a woman lay down, and then he would manipulate her downstairs with his hand until she had a release of hysteria. Not an orgasm. We all know they can't have orgasms. No, it was a release of hysteria. Yeah, how bad was it for women back in the Victorian days? An orgasm was a medical procedure. That's how bad it was. There was also the small problem that many women back in the day were just considered property to their husbands or their fathers. In fact, men who wanted a divorce but couldn't afford a divorce had the option of selling their wives. And this was actually done at a public auction, just like livestock, and whoever it is that won this auction got to have this wife. This was now his wife, and she had no choice in the matter. This was actually documented in the Thomas Hardy novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge. And if you're really ready to have your mind blown, this wasn't that long ago. The last recorded case of this was in Leeds in 1913. There are people alive today that were around when it was legal to sell your wife. But I don't know, maybe as a way to sort of deal with that whole situation, women of Victorian days indulged in some pretty crazy fashion. There's the aforementioned corset and tiny waist craze that I was talking about, but yeah, they would also include a bustle. The bustle was a little wire floof that they would put right above their butt that would cause the dress to kind of flare out behind them, kind of made it look like they just farted. It served other purposes. It kept the tips of the dress off the ground, and I guess depending on how you look at it, it could be seen as an act of modesty, like it's hiding their actual figure, or the exact opposite. It's supposed to be like a, you know, Victorian dump truck. But believe it or not, this was a minimized version of something that came before it. Really popular in the 1850s to 1870s, women wore these steel cages under their dresses called crinolines that flared the dress out up to 6 feet wide. It was a ridiculous fashion, and it was criticized at the time as well, but its merits are debated. Some women enjoyed wearing them because it kept their legs cooler with all the heavy material lifted off of them. It kind of created this space underneath there. That meant they could move their legs around a little easier, maybe walk around a bit more, and the wide dresses gave them more personal space and kept the creepers off at the parties. But on the other side, they were big and bulky and put women in literal cages. But the worst thing was, say it with me, they killed a lot of people. Crinolines caught fire constantly. Homes at the time were heated and lit by fireplaces and candles, and you can imagine trying to navigate around a space like that with a giant dress that flares out that wide and knocking stuff over. And the dress, by the way, was made of very flammable material. In fact, it's estimated around 3,000 women died every year from dress fires. On a lighter note, one popular trend in the 1800s was for women to wear hats with birds on them. And I don't mean patterns of birds, I mean an actual dead bird. And jewelry made out of insects was popular for a while too, especially beetles. But one last thing about women in the Victorian age, they did find one other way to sort of rebel against the system and everything that was going on, and I did not see this coming before I found it when I was doing research for this, but nipple rings were popular. Yeah, they called them bosom rings, and they started in Paris and kind of made their way around as a little sneaky act of rebellion, but it was mostly popular amongst the aristocracy and the wealthier women because they knew that if somehow they got caught, they wouldn't be punished like people in the lower classes would. On that note, let's go from nipple rings to haircuts. Number 4, barbershop quartets got started for horrifying reasons. Okay, so barbershop quartets as we think of them today with the outfits and the harmonies and all that actually got started after the Victorian era, mostly coming from African-American slave songs and harmonies and whatnot. But the origin of a barbershop quartet did kind of get its start in the Victorian days. And the reason that this got started is amazing. So many of you may know that way back in the day, barbers were a lot more than just people who cut hair. They were kind of like the town surgeons. In fact, they were called barber surgeons, and what separated them from doctors would, you know, determine what a disease was and offer poultices and herbs to take, you know, that kind of thing. But if anything needed to be opened up or any blood needed to come out, that's what the barber surgeon did. Steve Martin fans might remember the Saturday Night Live sketch, Theodoric Barber of York. That's kind of how it was.
You know, medicine is not an exact science, but we're learning all the time. Why, just 50 years ago, we would have thought your daughter's illness was brought on by demonic possession or witchcraft. But nowadays, we know that Isabel is suffering from an imbalance of bodily humors, perhaps caused by a toad or a small dwarf living in her stomach.
Eventually, medical knowledge advanced to the point where surgeons kind of became their own thing, but even up into the Victorian days, barbers did things like bloodlettings and set bones that had been broken, and even did some minor dentistry. I guess you could say they were like the doc in the box of their day, like instead of going to the emergency room, going to like an urgent care facility. But this was also, as I've talked about in a previous video, a time before anesthetic. So getting a tooth pulled or getting a bone set was an incredibly painful experience. An experience which would often lead to screaming. And you know what's bad for business? The sound of somebody screaming in pain from inside your business. So barbers would encourage those that were waiting their turn to play music. They would put instruments in the waiting room for them to play, and they would sing along with like call and response songs and shanties and whatnot. And if they could afford it, they would hire groups of people to stand outside of their shops to sing for the passersby to cover up the sound of the screaming from the inside. And this is where barbershop quartets were born. And number 5, they ate mummies. Yeah, there's this factoid going around, I've seen it here and there, that there's actually a shortage of Egyptian mummies in the world, that it's actually kind of rare to find them these days, because the majority of Egyptian mummies that have ever been found have been eaten by Victorians. For the record, that is a wild exaggeration, but it's also not much of a lie. So again, the Victorian time was this weird mix of terrible new ideas and terrible old ideas. So while some people were drinking irradiated water and causing their jaws to fall off, there was also this common belief going way, way back that ground up Egyptian mummies had medicinal properties. According to a 17th century physician, Dr. Robert James, mummies, or mumia as it was known, could serve as a blood thinner, painkiller, cough suppressant, anti-inflammatory, menstrual aid, and promotes wound healing. Yeah, spoiler warning, it does none of those things. So this falls into the category of medicinal cannibalism, and this goes back literally thousands of years. Way back in the day, it was believed that you would gain a person's strength by eating part of their body. In fact, when Roman gladiators were killed, people would often go down with scarves and soak up the blood and drink their blood to try to gain strength from it. And the mummy thing specifically, it's thought that it might have actually come from a bit of a misunderstanding or a mistranslation of the word bitumen. Bitumen, or bitumen, I've heard it pronounced both ways, it's basically the same as asphalt. It's this pitchy, black, sticky goo that is made out of hydrocarbons the same way oil is, so it's very abundant in the Middle East. And it does have some medicinal properties. It's antibacterial, so you can put it on a wound and it'll prevent it from becoming infected. So bitumen has gone by different names over the years, but it was a 10th century Persian physician named Razes that named it mumia after the word mum, which is the word for wax because it was sticky. And that's where the term mummy came from, because when Europeans first found these Egyptian mummies, they had this sort of black coating around them, and they assumed that it was this mumia substance. And they were right and wrong about that. Earlier Egyptian mummies were actually covered with resin, which would get blackened and harden over time. Now later mummies did actually use bitumen when it became more mainstream, and it wasn't just royalty that was getting this done, but it was the more sort of commoner people that were being embalmed with bitumen, which is kind of ironic because one of the reasons why people consumed Egyptian mummies in powdered form and everything, again, was because they thought that they were taking in their greatness, because they thought they were all royalty, but the bitumen that they were actually getting was from the commoners. And they also used mumia in paint to create a color called mummy brown, which I guess is better than having arsenic in it. So while they didn't eat most of the mummies in the world, they did definitely consume some Egyptian mummies, but there was a bit of a just mummy craze that went on in the Victorian days. After Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798, he brought some mummies back with him, and this sort of stirred everybody's imaginations, went through this big whole Egypt phase, Egyptomania is what it was called, and mummies from Egypt began to just flood the European continent for the next coming decades. And this led to mummy unwrapping parties. You know, that thing where you invite a whole bunch of people over and sip brandy while you desecrate the actual human body of a person? It was that kind of thing. But no, these were pretty much exactly what they sound like. Especially high-level aristocrats would have people over. They would maybe show off some of the trinkets and stuff that came from the tomb that they acquired. They would pass around drinks. And then the main event, they would bring the mummy out, they would put it on the table and unwrap the mummy and eventually reveal this face that had not been seen for millennia. Some found this to be strangely beautiful, others were horrified by it. And it was also common to find jewelry and trinkets and stuff hidden in the bandages of these Egyptian mummies that was part of their funerary process. So they would take these little trinkets and just kind of hand them out as party favors that people could take home. And some people made whole careers out of this, like Thomas Pettigrew, who was a well-known surgeon who had so many of these mummy wrapping parties, had unwrapped so many mummies over his time that he actually became a bit of an expert in it. In fact, he wrote a book called The History of Egyptian Mummies in 1834 that went on to become a big hit. Although in his studies of these mummies, he took the opportunity to measure their skulls to try to prove that they were actually Caucasians and not Arabs or Africans, because of course he did. You mean somebody assuming that an ancient non-white civilization couldn't have possibly built great things? I'm glad nobody does that anymore. Egyptomania went on for a large part of the 1800s, but it did eventually begin to wane because the field of archaeology, first of all, it kind of became more regulated and not such a free-for-all anymore. And, you know, people just kind of got used to it, you know? Seen one mummy, you've seen them all. But still, all over Europe and the United States for that matter, thousands of mummies have been unceremoniously displayed in museums and curiosity shops and sideshows, never having been returned to the tombs that they came from. But hey, at least they weren't eaten. So there's a lot more that I could add to this video, but I think you get the idea. You know, just like their engineering and scientific knowledge, their medical knowledge took huge leaps and bounds during the Victorian age. Like I talked about Jon Snow in the last video and how he was the guy who figured out that cholera was waterborne and kind of led to the germ theory of disease. Well, it turns out he was also one of the people who cracked anesthesiology. So for the first time in history, people could get surgeries done and not be in unbearable pain. And I don't think we can conceptualize what a big deal that is. I mean, yes, obviously it's less painful, but what that meant was back then people wouldn't get things done that needed to be done. Little minor surgeries that would be nothing today, thousands of people died from regularly back then. And maybe an even bigger thing is that surgeons could take their time to get everything right because there wasn't somebody screaming in pain while they were doing it. Like before anesthesia, a good surgeon was the one who did it the fastest. Like that's all that mattered. And the fastest surgeon of his day, and I'm going to assume of all time, was a guy named Robert Liston. He was famous for being able to amputate a leg in less than 5 minutes. His record was 28 seconds. But before you cheer him on too much, he also performed the only surgery in history that had a 300% mortality rate. Yeah, he was doing a leg amputation and he was going so fast that he accidentally cut off 2 of his assistant's fingers, and somebody watching got so horrified that they had a heart attack and died. And then later, both his assistant and the patient died of infection. So yeah, 300% mortality rate. So yeah, who else is happy to be alive today? All right, that's it for now. You guys go out there and have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. Hysteria. It's not just an amazing album by Def Leppard. By the way, that album turned 30 years old last year. We hear the word hysteria and we think of going a little crazy, maybe a little paranoid, a little out of control. That's when a person is hysterical. If a joke is hysterical, that just means it's really funny. Although technically it means that it's so funny that you lose your mind because you went hysterical. But the origin of the word hysteria comes from the word hystera, the Greek word for uterus. And this is why removing a uterus is called a hysterectomy. Now, if that connection is weird to you, that's because in the Victorian days, hysteria was something that was only applied to women. And the treatment for it was interesting. Let's put it this way. It's why the vibrator was invented. So it's 2018, and we're still dealing with gender issues in this society. And it's not just about equal pay and SJW type stuff. The way we experience the world, the differences between men and women, is deep-rooted stuff. There was a study that was conducted that I thought was really interesting. It was basically saying that from the age of only just a few days old, we start treating babies differently according to their gender. Babies have a natural instinctual grab reflex. If you put something in their hand, they naturally grab it. So a lot of times when we're playing with little babies, we'll, put our finger out, they'll grab our finger. And there was a study that was shown that said that we treat boys and girls differently in that moment. A lot of times if a boy grabs your finger, people will start to pull and kind of test the little boy's strength, but they don't really do that with the girl. And this is just sort of an unconscious thing. Nobody's thinking about gender issues when they do that. It's just something that we do. It's very unconscious, and it's just the first example of what we do when they're only a few days old that kind of continues throughout a person's life. So it's fair to say that there's still a ways for us to go, but it's also good for us to look back and see just how far we've come. The Victorian era was weird in a lot of ways. We were just entering the industrial age, science and medicine had come a long way, but there was still a lot we didn't understand. So there were all kinds of weird medical treatments that made sense based on their knowledge of the day, but they make absolutely no sense to us now. They were just smart enough to be dangerous. And one of those things was the idea of female hysteria. Hysteria is one of those words we don't really use anymore. It's kind of fallen out of favor, but back in the day it was used to describe pretty much anything. It was just kind of a way of categorizing female instability. It was used as a diagnosis for everything from epileptic fits to fevers to coarse language. It was a Victorian era version of bitches be trippin'. But this isn't a purely Victorian assumption. This goes all the way back to ancient Greece. A physician named Horatius actually described the uterus as an animal within an animal that needed to be satiated or else it would strangle the woman from within. And how did you control this animal? By applying sweet-smelling oils to the genital area. Vigorously. In the Middle Ages, they attributed hysteria to demonic possession because of course they did, and they thought that women were more susceptible to demonic possession because the vagina was an entry point for demons. Because of course it was. And the only way to release this demon was pelvic manipulation by a midwife. By the Victorian era, they had let go of the whole demonic thing and decided that hysteria was the result of societal pressures on the frail and dainty women of the day, I do declare. In fact, fainting was a common thing amongst women of the day, so much so that well-off homes would have a fainting room set aside just so that the woman could go in and, compose herself on a settee. And it's still debated exactly what the fainting was about, whether it was the tight corsets that restricted their breathing. Some suspected it actually had to do with the fact that lead and arsenic was used in makeup back then. Seriously, the Victorian era was a nightmare. Especially if you were a doctor, because these fainting women suffering from hysteria only had one treatment. And I think we figured out by now what that was. Doctors of the Victorian day spent so much time driving around to women's homes and getting them off that they started complaining about wrist pain and hand cramps. They were basically getting carpal tunnel from this. This got so bad that they got as creative as a stoner without a bong and started creating devices so that they wouldn't have to use their hands to do it. Everything from a water cannon to a steam-powered Sybian that the women could just kind of sit on. As homes started becoming electrified, appliances started becoming electrified as well. And some of the first appliances were all geared toward women because the women folk were the ones that were, sitting around the house doing chores all day long. In fact, the very first electrical appliance was a sewing machine. The fifth electrical appliance ever created was a vibrator. Think about all the electrical appliances we use today. The vibrator was made before almost all of them. According to author Rachel Maines, it preceded the electric vacuum cleaner by some 9 years, the electric iron by 10, and the electric frying pan by more than a decade, possibly reflecting consumer priorities. By the way, none of this was considered sexual. Doctors of the day didn't think that women could have an orgasm without penetration, so they didn't even call this an orgasm, they called it a hysterical paroxysm. In fact, tampons were more controversial back then because of the penetration issue. So the idea of roving doctors traveling house to house, pleasuring women right in front of their husbands sounds insane today. It was a perfectly normal thing back then. Which is amazing to me. The Victorian era was so chaste and so, demure, and the women couldn't show their ankles and that kind of thing. And yet the doctors were basically glorified gigolos. Damn, Victorians, you crazy. But I guess every era has their social norms that later on look crazy. I mean, just look at the fashion that was going on when Def Leppard's Hysteria came out. So what thing today do you think we'll think was crazy in 50 years? Talk about it in the comments. And with that, I bid you adieu. You guys go out and have an eye-opening week, and I'll see you on Monday. Love you guys, take care. Let's see if we get demonetized after that last one. The world is littered with mysterious people whose origins have never been discovered. D.B. Cooper, the man in the iron mask. Tommy Wiseau. But perhaps no mystery is more enduring than the mysterious and disturbing case of Kaspar Hauser. Let's set the scene. It's Nuremberg, Germany, May 26, 1828. Actually, Germany isn't really a thing yet. It's actually an ex-province of the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. A young boy is found wandering through the streets, disoriented and confused. He's dressed like a poor person, his jacket torn and tattered, but he's also wearing a really expensive silk scarf and has a finely embroidered handkerchief with the initials KH stitched on it. And even though he was around 10 or 11 years old, he walked like a toddler, like he'd never walked before in his life, and he complained about his feet hurting, although his old and worn out shoes probably didn't help that out very much. And he couldn't really speak. He could say his own name and basically repeat what other people said, and everything that he could say was weirdly horse-related. In fact, the only full sentence that he could speak was, "I want to be a horseman like my father." Who was this kid's father? Apparently he didn't know, but a note that he carried on him said that his father was in the cavalry and that the writer of that note, who was not his father, was afraid for his own life. This kid just kept getting weirder. He was taken in by Friedrich Dahmer, a local schoolmaster, who found more peculiarities of Kaspar's the longer he was around him. For one thing, he was very sensitive to light and sound. He could see in almost near darkness and could hear a whisper perfectly clear all the way across the room. On the flip side, being out in the sun was painful and blinding to him. He only ate bread and water, everything else made him gag. He acted like he'd never seen a candle or a mirror before. In fact, the first time that he saw himself in the mirror, he tried to catch the reflection and he didn't recognize himself. It was almost like he'd been locked away in a dark room his whole life, and as he started to learn how to talk, his story began to take shape. Or at least what he knew began to take shape, which wasn't much. All he could remember was being kept in the dark for years in a small enclosure, so small that he couldn't actually stand up, so his feet were totally tender. And he had no idea who his captor was because he never actually saw his face. And when he was sent to Nuremberg, the captor blindfolded him and made him look down at the floor the whole time so he couldn't tell where he was coming from. Terrifying background, for sure, but under Dahmer's care, Kaspar began to thrive. He showed a knack for drawing and music and actually became a little bit of a local celebrity. Things were looking up for Kaspar. But then his past came back to haunt him. One evening in late 1829, Kaspar didn't come down for dinner, so Dahmer searched the house looking for him. He found him in the cellar, bleeding from a cut across his forehead. According to Kaspar, he was attacked while he was on the privy by a man who said, "You will have to die ere you leave Nuremberg." And the voice of this man was the same as his captor. And about 9 months later, people in the house heard a gunshot and they rushed up to Kaspar's room to find him on the floor with a head wound. And after he recovered, he claimed that he was standing on a chair trying to grab some books, and then he slipped off the chair, and on his way down, he accidentally grabbed a pistol that was hanging on the wall, and somehow that caused the pistol to go off. Yeah. Kaspar was a problematic guest, and for that reason, he kind of bounced from one person's care to another. One of them was a guy named Lord Stanhope, who was particularly obsessed with finding out Kaspar's origins and spent quite a bit of money to do so. He took Kaspar to Hungary because apparently Kaspar knew how to say some Hungarian words, and he claimed at one point that his mother was a Hungarian countess, but it didn't produce any results, and along the way, Lord Stanhope began to sort of doubt his credibility. In December of 1831, Kaspar was transferred to the town of Ansbach, where he was under the care of another schoolmaster, Johann Georg Meyer. It did not go well. Meyer was a strict disciplinarian, and he didn't really trust Kaspar. He felt like he was withholding and deceitful, so the two of them kind of butted heads quite a bit throughout 1833. And toward the end of the year, Lord Stanhope was supposed to visit, and he said that he was going to take Kaspar over to England to kind of look around over there, and Kaspar was really looking forward to that. But then on December 14th, the story of Kaspar Hauser came to a fittingly mysterious end. Kaspar came home from the park with a deep stab wound in his chest. He claimed that a man lured him into the park saying that he had information about his mother, but once they got into the park, he actually stabbed him while handing him a bag. Police later searched the park and they found a violet bag with a note inside. The note was written in mirror writing and it said this: "Hauser will be able to tell you quite precisely how I look and where I am. To save Hauser the effort, I want to tell you myself where I come. ... I come from ... the Bavarian border ... on the river ... I will even tell you the name M.L.O. Helpful." Kaspar deteriorated over the next few days, incoherently muttering something about writing with pencil before he finally passed away on December 17th. He was buried next to a tombstone that read, "Here lies Kaspar Hauser, riddle of his time. His birth was unknown, his death mysterious. 1833. From here, the mystery of Kaspar Hauser only deepened. That note that was found at the park, for example, contained several grammatical errors that Kaspar commonly used, and it was also folded in a way that Kaspar often folded his letters. Did he stab himself? Was there some mysterious conspiracy around him? Did his captor come back to fulfill his dastardly plan? This has perplexed people for over 200 years. There are two main competing theories around Kaspar Hauser's identity. The first one is something that I'm sure many of you have been yelling at the screen throughout this entire video, which is that he was just a liar and an attention seeker. I mean, it worked for him. He got to stay with some very respectable people, got to travel with a lord. Not bad for a peasant kid. Some of the evidence for this theory is the fact that his story had massive inconsistencies inside of it, and every single person that took care of him at one point or another had trouble with the fact that he lied all the time. In fact, Lord Stanhope himself wrote a book later on that countered many of Hauser's accusations in his story and said that he was a very deceitful person. For example, his claim that he only ate bread and water his entire life is kind of hard to believe because that will inevitably lead to scurvy, and he didn't have scurvy. Plus, his behavior doesn't really line up with other stories of people who were kept in captivity for long periods of time. In fact, psychiatrist Carl Leonhard once wrote, "If he had been living since childhood under the conditions he describes, he would not have developed beyond the condition of an idiot. Indeed, he would not have remained alive long. His tale is so full of absurdities that it is astonishing that it was ever believed and is even today still believed by many people." So according to this theory, he injured himself whenever he wanted to get something from people. For example, that first time that he got that cut on his forehead, and he claimed that he was attacked by his captor while he was on the loo, well, it turns out that he and Dahmer had had a bit of an argument the day before. And his fatal wound occurred when he was hoping that Lord Stanhope would take him to England. And in the case of that fatal stabbing, he probably intended to do a flesh wound and it just went too far. He wouldn't be the first person to injure himself to get attention. In fact, there's an entire mental illness around this called Munchausen syndrome, or it used to be called Munchausen syndrome. Today it's called factitious disorder imposed on self. Although most people who have factitious disorder don't do it to achieve any specific goal or to have any kind of financial gain, most of them just do it out of this deep-seated need to be pitied and cared for. But that's not what makes Kaspar's story so intriguing. If that was it, it probably would have been forgotten a long time ago. But there is another theory. It's pretty juicy. Theory number 2 is that Kaspar was the heir to the House of Baden. Much like Lone Star in Spaceballs, Kaspar was an honest-to-God prince. In theory. To explain this, we kind of have to get knee-deep in European ancestry, so let's get in the spirit. The Grand Duchy of Baden is a territory in the southwest of what is now modern Germany along the Rhine River. This was a quite perplexing time in history, a period in betwixt the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire and the creation of Germany, a period of European history that many scholars refer to as a cluster. The ruler of Baden at the turn of the 19th century was Charles and his wife Stephanie de Beaumais, who was a cousin and adopted daughter of Napoleon. Stephanie bore 3 daughters and 2 sons, both of which died in infancy, so when Charles passed away in 1818, his throne passed to Ludwig I, his uncle. Ludwig reigned for 12 years before he died in 1830. Upon his death, the throne passed to his half-brother Leopold. This happened at about the same time that Kaspar's story was traveling through the countryside like butter on crumpets. And it spawned some scandalous scuttlebutt. The rumor was that Leopold's mother, Louise Caroline, the Countess of Hochberg, was a notoriously ambitious woman, as she masterminded her son's ascent to the throne by removing an heir from Charles I. One of the male children who died in infancy would have been around Kaspar's age, and many began to speculate that Caroline switched out the baby with a dying baby, and then hid away the legitimate heir. And when they discovered that the heir was alive and well and living as Kaspar Hauser, they had him murdered to preserve the crown. So perhaps Kaspar Hauser came from royalty. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time crazy machinations were used to get the crown. So yeah, a big part of Kaspar's story was that he came from a wealthy family. He had spent a lot of time around horses, he had that silk scarf that no peasant would have been able to afford, and he actually knew some details of stately manners that were able to be corroborated later on. Now, it is quite possible that both of these scenarios are true. He was deceitful, he was a schemer and a liar, but then when the story started getting around, this rumor that he was the legitimate heir to the throne, then the royal family, you know, they nipped it in the bud and they took him out. But this royal connection, or supposed royal connection, is why this story continued to grow and why people are still talking about it 200 years later. Plenty of books have been written on this case. Werner Herzog did a movie about it called The Mystery of Kaspar Hauser, and of course, when modern DNA testing became a thing, people jumped on it. A 1998 DNA test that used some blood sample from the underwear that he was wearing when he was murdered was kind of a bummer. It didn't turn out any connection to any royal family or descendants of the royal family. However, in 2002, a different DNA test was done with mitochondrial DNA, and they compared it with a woman named Astrid von Medinger, who was actually a female descendant of Stephanie de Beaumais, and it actually showed a 95% match. Double, however, they used a different blood sample in 2002 than they did in 1998, and those two blood samples did not match each other, so it's still not fully known which of the blood samples are even his. So, I'll leave it to you. What do you think? Crazy attention-seeking liar or legitimate heir to the throne? Or both? Let's put a pin on this mystery down in the comments. So that's Kaspar Hauser. I've been kind of fascinated by this story my whole life. I grew up with these, real-life mystery books when I was a kid, and this was always one of them that just really stood out to me. It was just fascinating. Nobody knows where this kid came from, and I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks again for watching. You guys go out now, have an eye-opening rest of the week, and I'll see you on Monday. Love you guys. Take care. Near Dixon, Kentucky is a junction in the road where U.S. Highway 41 meets State Highway 56. It's labeled on the map as Harpe's Head Road State Historic Site. Its name hints at one of the most notorious crime sprees in U.S. history, bred from the very war that created the country as we know it. This is the story of the Harpe brothers, America's first serial killers. Before we begin, I want to give a quick warning that we're going to be talking about some pretty nasty stuff in this video. In fact, it'll be a miracle this video doesn't get demonetized. Don't think just because we're talking about historical events that it's somehow tamer or more sanitized because it was a simpler time or whatever. If anything, it's the opposite. I'm just saying, I know some of you guys watch my videos with your kids. This may be one of those episodes where you just want to send them to the other room. Put a different video on for them. Here, I'll link to a video about smart animals. That's cute. Are they gone? Okay, let's begin. First, let's set the scene. It's the late 1700s. The United States as we know it doesn't really exist yet. Tensions between the colonies and the British Empire are at an all-time high. Protests broke out in multiple cities. In 1770, the British troops fired on a group of protesters in Boston, killing 3 on the spot. 2 more died later on from their wounds. This came to be known as the Boston Massacre. Although, like most things in history, the word massacre is a bit of an embellishment. The peaceful protesters were more like a drunken mob that descended on 9 redcoats who panicked and fired into the crowd. But, still, tension. 3 years later, the Boston Tea Party happened when protesters dumped more than 300 chests of British tea into the harbor to protest the Tea Act, which led to the most caffeinated fish of all time. All of this came to a head when fighting began in Lexington and Concord, setting off the American Revolutionary War in 1775. But just like the Boston Massacre wasn't quite as one-sided as we were brought up to believe, not everyone in the colonies were on board with the revolution. There were a lot of people who were doing just fine with the British and kind of wanted to stay with them. Like, think about how divided we are today, right? They were just as divided, but they were actually at war. Acts of violence broke out between neighbors on the different sides all the time. This was especially true on the frontier, which at the time were territories like Kentucky and Tennessee. So the idea of the frontier it's more of an abstract concept these days. There's nothing really today that you can compare it to. The frontier wasn't just unsettled wild land, it was kind of lawless. Every man for himself. There was no authority to go to if you got in trouble. And there were plenty of ways to get in trouble. Roads were little more than well-worn Indian trails through overgrown forests where around every corner or behind every tree there could be a gang of bandits ready to rob you, or hostile natives ready to protect their land with violence. And it's in this violent, divided world that the Harpe brothers emerged. So another thing about this time period is this was a time of myths and legends like Johnny Appleseed and Daniel Boone, bigger-than-life heroes who tamed the wilderness and created a path for manifest destiny. But where you find bigger-than-life heroes, you'll also find bigger-than-life villains. And that was the Harpe brothers. So all of that is to say that it's a challenge to discern what is fact and what is legend in this story. These are events that took place over 200 years ago involving some pretty seriously shady dudes. So let's start with the story. The story is they grew up in a family of loyalists who sided with the crown. And things escalated to the point that one day a group of revolutionaries attacked their family and lynched their parents. The Harpe brothers then fled into the wilderness where they were taken in by an Indian tribe. The tribe taught them how to survive in the bush and, even more importantly, how to fight and kill like warriors. And after that, they spent the rest of their lives using those skills to take revenge against the entire human race, murdering anybody who came across their path and displaying cruelty beyond all human comprehension. That's the story. But there are a few problems with this story. First of all, the Harpe brothers weren't brothers at all. They were actually cousins. Both of their fathers were Scottish immigrants who settled in North Carolina, and they grew up together. Their names were Micaiah and Wiley Harpe, but they took on the nicknames Big and Little Harpe because, one was bigger than the other. Not the most creative nicknames I've ever heard, but they got the job done. Micaiah Big Harpe was slightly older and obviously bigger. Contemporary accounts described him as a more impulsive and violent of the two, and he often used his size to get his way. Wiley Little Harpe was the brains of the duo, much more strategic and conniving, but just as ruthless. Now, as for the rest of their origin story, it's not known for sure whether their parents were actually murdered by revolutionaries, but as loyalists, they definitely had targets on their backs. And this tension and ostracism definitely would have shaped their attitudes toward the world as they grew up. And the bit about them being taken in by Indian tribes, again, it's hard to say it, that really happened to them, but white settlers intermingled with Indian tribes all the time, especially on the frontier. In fact, I was just reading in a book about how a lot of the early colonists abandoned their European communities to go live with Indian communities because they preferred their way of life better. Like, especially in the Northeast, the Haudenosaunee tribes, the Five Nations tribes, were a lot more egalitarian and democratic than the Europeans that came over and were all obsessed with status and social class and whatnot. In fact, the argument's been made that those values of egalitarianism and democracy kind of rubbed off on those American colonists and gave them that streak for independence and democracy that led them toward the revolution. I talked about the Boston Tea Party earlier. The people in the Boston Tea Party dressed up as Mohawk Indians because that represented a more democratic way of life that they wanted. But as I mentioned, some people were loyal to the British, and that's the side that the Harpe brothers were a part of. And as the Revolutionary War took hold, they joined a Tory gang in North Carolina and waged guerrilla warfare against Patriot colonists. That's one way of putting it. The other way of putting it is that the war gave them a good excuse to assault, steal, and murder people. Although they did actually join the British in a couple of battles, including the Battle of Blackstock in 1780 and Cowpens in 1781. And then the Americans defeated the British at the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, and the war ended, meaning those colonial patriots that they'd been terrorizing and fighting against were now in charge. So they got the hell out of North Carolina and went west into Tennessee, which was just a territory at the time, mostly Indian country. By the way, that's another thing that the story of the Harpe brothers teaches us, is that, the way we learn about American history is that we fought the war, and then the war was over, and everything was good, all was right with the world. But the truth is way messier than that. Like I said before, there were major fractures over the Revolutionary War, and those fractures didn't just disappear once the war was over. In fact, the violence of the war years only intensified the hostilities and reprisals. So yeah, they moved into Tennessee where they were out of the jurisdiction of the authorities. And they took with them a trio of women named Maria Davidson, Susan Wood, and Sarah Rice. Now, again, details are fuzzy here, but some say that they were wives and accomplices of the Harpe brothers. Others say they were kidnapped. There is public record of Wiley Harpe marrying Sarah Rice, but apparently they all kind of shared the women. So either they were like a polyamorous Bonnie and Clyde situation, or they were two monsters with a harem of kidnapped victims. Either way, they went west and they hid out in the Cherokee-Chickamauga village of Nickajack near modern-day Chattanooga for about 12 or 13 years. They ran a pig farm and earned a reputation as men that you didn't mess with, because they would not hesitate to murder you. I mean, the frontier was chock full of rogues and bandits hiding from authorities and preying on travelers and new settlers, but even amongst the bad guys, the Harpe brothers stood out. In fact, they weren't alone. They had a band of other outlaws with them, one of whom was a guy named Moses Doss. And maybe this gives some kind of clue as to what exactly their relationship was with the women, but at some point Moses became concerned for them. Perhaps he expressed his concern to them, maybe he threatened to take them to some authorities or something, but either way, they killed him. This is going to be a recurring theme. So by 1797, they were living in a cabin on Beavers Creek near Knoxville, Tennessee, and this is when something changed, and the Harpe brothers went on the move. One story is that people started noticing that their pig farm had seemed to have run out of pigs, but they also kept coming to market to sell pigs all the time. And simultaneously, probably unrelated, a lot of other people's pigs were going missing. And they'd probably been stealing pigs for a long time, but nobody wanted to mess with them. But in 1796, Tennessee became a state, meaning there was now some kind of law and order in the area. So yeah, it was time to hit the road. So in 1798, they set off on a trail of death and destruction across Illinois, Kentucky, and Tennessee that they are still known for to this day. And it all started with a man they met named Johnson at a bar, or a rowdy groggery, as they called it. So the story goes that they met the man and noticed that he had a nice full coin purse, and they convinced him to travel with them. Now this wasn't that unusual back then. Like I said, the roads were super dangerous, so people tended to travel in groups. So the Harpes convinced him that they could help keep him safe. And so they left together, and instead, they killed him and took his money. A passersby found his body floating in the Holston River a few days later. It had been ripped open and filled with stones, which kind of became a trademark of the Harpe brothers. They would fill the body cavity with stones and then dump it into a river to make it sink to the bottom. Which is kind of horrifying, because even with all the killings that we know about that they committed, there's probably tons more that we don't know about, because the bodies were never found. The Harpes then moved east toward the Cumberland Gap to meet up with their wives. They killed twice more while on the Wilderness Road. This time was a pair of travelers named Paca and Bates. The second time was a young man named Langford, but like their other victims, they didn't dispose of the body very well. Langford's body was found by a nearby innkeeper who recognized it, figuring out that it was the Harpes that committed it. With their rate of violence escalating, a posse formed and chased the Harpes, who were caught on Christmas Day in 1799. They were imprisoned in Stamford, Kentucky. Enough evidence was found for a trial in the District Court of Danville, Kentucky, but just before the trial date in March, the Harpes escaped. Some think with the help of their wives. In April, the Kentucky governor placed a $300 reward on each of their heads. It's about $7,000 in today's money. Now, one might think that they would consider that a bit too close for comfort and lay low for a while, but they didn't. They kept on killing people. They headed west where they killed 2 more men on the trail, and then near the mouth of Saline Creek they came across 3 men who were camping, and they joined them for some s'mores. I'm kidding, they killed them. They eventually found themselves at an area called Cave-In Rock in southern Illinois, which was a stronghold of the river pirate Samuel Mason. Yeah, I mentioned the bands of bandits and robbers on the trails and stuff like that. Did I mention the river pirates? The Mason gang used the cave as a hideout, and from there they would attack supply boats heading up the Ohio River. And this seemed to be as good a place as any for the Harpes to settle down for a while with their wives and 3 children. Oh yeah, they had some kids at this point. And this was a good fit for a while, but eventually the Harpes found a way to cause more trouble. Now, keep in mind, the Mason gang was one of the most brutal gang of pirates around, but even they saw the Harpes' brutality and were like, dude, chill. Because the Harpes apparently had a kick out of taking travelers up to the top of the bluff, stripping them naked, and then throwing them off the cliff. Like you do. So yeah, the Mason gang kicked them out. And this really is what made the Harpes stand out. There were tons of thieves that would kill to protect themselves or to serve their own interests, but the Harpes, they killed for sport. They got off on it. Once they were dismissed from the Mason gang, they headed back into eastern Tennessee and continued their killing spree. In July 1798, they killed a farmer named Bradbury, a man named Hardin, and a boy named Coffee. More bodies were soon discovered. William Ballard was disemboweled and thrown into the Holston River. James Brassel had his throat slashed and found on Brassel's Knob. And John Graves and his teenage son, their heads were axed in south central Kentucky. And in Logan County, Kentucky, they killed a little girl, a young slave, and an entire family who were sleeping at a campsite. They also killed and disemboweled a man named Trowbridge in August. With the violence escalating and a bounty on their heads, they found themselves being chased by various posses. And in one close call, the posse was bearing down on them, and Big Harpe's infant daughter started crying. And, you know, the crying threatened to give them away, so he bashed her head against a tree. He would later confess genuine remorse for this. It's the only murder he ever claimed to feel bad about. But it was in the summer of 1799 when it all finally caught up to the Harpe brothers. They came upon the home of Moses Stiegel in Webster County, Kentucky, and purchased a room for the night. Actually, it was kind of tradition back then that if you had a home and there were travelers going through the frontier, it was tradition to put them up in your home. While there, they killed an overnight guest named Major William Love. The story is that they apparently had to share a room with Love. He was snoring a little too loud. So Big put an end to that. They then entered the kitchen and demanded that Miss Stiegel make them some food. She obliged, but then her 4-month-old boy started crying, and, well, we know how Big Harpe dealt with crying babies. And when Mrs. Stiegel turned around and saw the sight of Big Harpe cutting her son's throat and screamed, they killed her as well, and then burned the cabin down. This event would be the Harpe's undoing. When Moses Stiegel came home and saw what happened, he quickly found a posse, and vigilante justice was about to take hold. By the time Stiegel's posse caught up with them, they had already murdered 2 more men named Hudgens and Gilmore on the trail. As the posse closed in around their camp, Little escaped, but Big was chased down. They managed to shoot him once in the leg and once in the back. And as the legend has it, as he lay there bleeding out, he confessed to his killings to the men who stood over him waiting for him to die. That's when Moses Stiegel took Big's own butcher knife and cut off his head. According to the story, he did it while Big was still alive, and he did it as slowly as possible to extend the agony. Micaiah's last words were, quote, "You're a goddamn rough butcher, but cut on and be damned." Once it was over, Moses took Big's head and impaled it on the limb of a tree near the intersection of a local road to serve as a warning for other would-be bandits. That spot became known as Harpe's Head Road, that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. But Little got away. He headed west again with the women and returned to the Mason gang at Cave-In Rock, this time using the name John Seton. There, he managed to stay alive for another 4 years before his insatiable greed got the best of him. Turns out Mason had a $2,000 bounty on his head. That's about $50,000 today. So Little and another pirate turned on Mason and decapitated him. They took the head in for the reward money, and as they began to leave, a victim from an earlier riverboat attack recognized them. Authorities immediately arrested him, but he escaped again. Maybe his nickname maybe he should have stuck with Wiley. That would have been better than Little. But a posse did catch up with him, and he was finally brought to justice. tried, sentenced, and hung to death. And just to make sure he was dead, they cut off his head as well and placed it on a spike near the Natchez Trace as a warning to other outlaws. This was the February of 1804, and their bloody spree of violence finally came to an end. The 3 women were arrested and tried, but the community actually took pity on them. Again, there's still debate around whether or not they were willing accomplices or kidnapped victims, but in this case they were seen as victims, or they were able to convince people they were anyway. Perhaps a piece of evidence that helped convince the jury was the fact that that whole thing where Micaiah murdered his own child, apparently that happened several times. There were 3 children, between the 5 of them, that survived, but apparently they had several more children, all of which were dispatched in the interest of expediency. It's hard to imagine a woman willingly staying with somebody who does that to their children or actively participating in it. Of course, there are female psychopaths too. Regardless, the 3 of them went on to marry, raise families, and live the rest of their lives in peace. In the end, the Harpes claimed to have killed 39 people, but that number may be closer to 50 or higher. Like I said before, the way they disposed of bodies means that there could have been a lot more that nobody knew about. The Harpe name became synonymous with violence, lawlessness, and unspeakable evil. And many family members changed their last names to hide the fact that they were related to them. Some just dropped the E, while others changed their names significantly. In fact, there's a rumor that Wyatt Earp was a descendant of the Harpe brothers. Harpe, Earp. But in a way, bear with me because this could get pretentious for just a second, aren't we all descendants of the Harpe brothers? The United States, for all its positives, has always had a dark underbelly to it. Those tensions that were created in the fire of the Revolution, the tensions that created the Harpes, they're still around. They don't take the same form they used to. They've evolved over time, but they're still there, kind of woven into the fabric of our history. You know, we celebrate the great heroes from the Revolution, but we forget that the Revolution was messy and created fractures that led to unspeakable violence. There are similar fractures in society today. Fractures that manifest in evil and violent acts with relentless, overwhelming regularity. Am I working too hard on this? I'm just saying that there are lessons to be learned from the Harpe brothers. This isn't just a salacious story about a couple of serial killers. They were serial killers formed by the very birth of this nation. Every rose has its thorn. All right, that's it for now. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next Monday. Love you guys. Take care. Don't call it a comeback. I've had glasses for years. Okay, so in 1938, Orson Welles shocked the nation with his radio play War of the Worlds. Radio, for all you whippersnappers out there, was a type of live entertainment that didn't have images, it only had sound. It was kind of like a podcast over the air. It was a whole thing. Anyway, in this radio drama, it was presented sort of like a news broadcast, and it tricked a lot of people into thinking that we were actually being invaded by an alien species. A plague of aliens, if you will. It scared people so much that there were reports of people flooding police stations begging for gas masks in order to save them. Apparently the highways out of New Jersey were completely jammed up with people trying to escape. And somewhere in Nebraska, apparently a woman ran into a church and yelled, "The end of the world is here, go home and be with your families." Orson Welles, the original troll. Luckily, they didn't have any reason to fear because in War of the Worlds, spoiler alert, the aliens were killed off by our microbes. Which, not to go on a tangent, that's always bugged me, because how did these super advanced aliens not know about microbes? We figured that out 100 years ago. Oh my god, don't get me started on the movie Signs. An alien race, hyper-intelligent, so much further beyond where we are, can travel all the way across the galaxy to land on a planet that's 80% water when their only weakness is water. Come on, Shyamalan. Anyway, while microbes are apparently our only defense against killer aliens, they can also be our biggest enemy. On Monday, I did a video about overpopulation and whether or not Thanos from Avengers Infinity War was right in what he wanted to do. And in it, I talked about the Black Death and how that's one of the only times in human history where our population actually went down worldwide. But that was not the only plague in history. In fact, some were even worse. Just like in War of the Worlds, the most potent killer on Earth are our smallest organisms. Might be the only thing that movie got right. So this video is about the top 5 plagues in human history, and it got a little bit complicated to put this list together because there are some diseases that have wiped out tons of people throughout history, but never at one time. And then there were other diseases that only popped up once, but wiped out a big percentage of the world in the process. And then there are some that popped up over and over again in plagues in various places throughout the world. So I tried to kind of shoot the needle on this one and do a little bit of both. Tell me what you think. Number 5, HIV. HIV stands for the human immunodeficiency virus. And a lot of times this gets confused with AIDS. HIV and AIDS are sort of related, but AIDS is actually more of a collection of symptoms that you get from HIV. AIDS standing for acquired immune deficiency syndrome. And what sets this worldwide plague apart from all the others on our list is it's still happening right now. AIDS was first identified in 1981, although the origination of the disease went back a decade or two before that, and since then it's killed nearly 35 million people around the world. HIV is just a bastard of a virus that does all kinds of weird things. It first hits you almost like the flu. You get it after you've been exposed a couple of weeks afterwards. You get flu-like symptoms that just kind of passes. Most people don't think anything of it. Some people don't get any symptoms at all. But it's the second stage of HIV that makes it especially awful because it's completely asymptomatic. You carry HIV for anywhere from 10 to 15 years with no symptoms whatsoever, and most people don't even know it. But what's going on underneath is it's slowly attacking the immune system, taking it down piece by piece by piece for a long period of time until eventually you hit stage 3. And stage 3 is when your immune system is just so vulnerable and weakened because of years and years of attacks underneath the surface that you basically are prone to any kind of crazy infection. They call them opportunistic infections. People in this stage experience extreme weight loss. They have chronic coughing that doesn't ever go away. They have lung infections, skin infections pop up quite a bit. Sometimes tuberculosis can break out. And this is what we call AIDS, full-blown AIDS. And eventually it's one of those opportunistic infections that actually kills the person. Now, one of the real tragedies about HIV is that because it was sexually transmitted and because it was mostly in the gay community in the early days, it wasn't really paid enough attention to until it really got out of control. Eventually, a string of high-profile celebrity cases popped up like Rock Hudson, Freddie Mercury, and Anthony Perkins. These people all died and brought a lot of attention to it. And then there are these tragic stories of people who acquired it from getting a blood transfusion because they didn't test for these things in the early days. People like Ryan White, Arthur Ashe, and Isaac Asimov even died of this. The arrival of AIDS set off a total panic around sex. Safe sex, the word safe sex became a household term. And of course, this happened right about the time that I was finally old enough to have sex, and sex became basically Russian roulette. It really did affect my entire generation and the way we looked at promiscuity and intimate relationships. Now, luckily today, HIV isn't the immediate death sentence that it used to be. There's a certain cocktail of drugs that you can take, or various different combinations of drugs that can usually keep it under control, and you can live a relatively long life. Regular screenings and sex education has helped to manage the disease in most of the world, but it remains a problem in Africa, where over 36.7 million people currently have the disease. So unfortunately, this is still very much a plague we're right in the middle of. Number 4, malaria. I hate mosquitoes. While there's never been a specific plague of malaria that we can point to, this one makes the list just off of sheer numbers. In 2015, more than 212 million people contracted malaria, and that's actually down 29% from 2010. But thanks to modern medicine, only about 500,000 died. That's still a lot, but a lot less than 212 million. But before modern medicine, it was not a good time. Some have actually estimated that malaria has killed off half of all people who have ever lived. That's a pretty hard claim to verify, but it is very prevalent in places where we kind of evolved out of in the early days of our species. In fact, the bacteria that causes malaria was found in a mosquito that was trapped in amber over 30 million years ago. Yeah, just like Jurassic Park. They found dinosaur blood and malaria. Malaria is, of course, spread by mosquitoes, more specifically the species Anopheles, and even more specifically, only the female of the species. Now, it's actually not caused by a bacteria or virus. It's actually caused by a single-cell organism called a plasmodium that multiplies inside of our red blood cells. And because this is transmitted by mosquitoes, this is what's known as a vector-borne illness. So if you're unlucky enough to have the wrong mosquito bite you, in about a week or so, you can experience things like severe abdominal pain, nausea, diarrhea, and vomiting, you know, all those nice little nasties. You can also get extreme fatigue and low blood pressure that can actually cause you to faint say if you stand up or move too fast. This is all from the anemia that sets in after having all this red blood cells taken out of your system. This anemia weakens the body, weakens the immune system, makes you prone to infections, and can cause blood clots that can form in your brain, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, not good. So if you're ever traveling in tropical areas like Africa, Central or South America, or the Middle East, and start to come down with some of these symptoms, see a doctor immediately. So while billions have been poured into fighting this disease from foundations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and a lot of progress has been made in terms of helping people to survive it, it still remains a threat to nearly half of the people on the planet that live in these areas. And for now anyway, there's no vaccine. There's a mosquito in here right now. Number 3, bubonic plague. This is what everybody thinks of when you say the word plague. I mean, it's right there in the name. It's a bacterium called Yersinia pestis that's actually transmitted by fleas. And gee, I wonder why they called it pestis. This is the disease that caused the Black Death, but it also popped up various times throughout history, all the way up into the 20th century. The first recorded instance of this plague was the plague of Justinian in the year 541 to 542. This killed 25 million people, and then 50 million after recurrences that popped up in the centuries following that. It wound up wiping out 13% of the entire world population. So one of my little pet peeves is when people use the word decimate the wrong way. People say they got decimated as if it just wiped out everything, but the word decimated actually means to reduce by 10%. So in the case of the plague of Justinian, yeah, it literally decimated the planet. The Black Death occurred between 1347 and 1351. It only lasted 4 years, but it killed nearly 200 million people, or 30 to 60% of the population of Europe. I could do, and many have done, an entire video on the Black Death. It is absolutely fascinating, and it changed the world in ways that we're still feeling today. The Plague of London occurred between 1665 and 1666, and while it was contained just in London, it killed a quarter of the population. So just imagine 1 out of every 4 people you know just dying in 1 year. And the third plague pandemic hit in 1855 in China and India, and it lasted up until, wait for it, 1959. And in the process, it killed over 12 million people. Now, if you got the bubonic plague, one of the first things you would notice, aside from feeling sick, is that your lymph nodes would swell up to the size of chicken eggs. These are known as buboes, hence the name bubonic. And from there, things get really fun, because then your skin breaks out in fluid-filled cysts and boils all over your body. And your extremities, like your fingers, turn black from necrosis. This, hence the word black and Black Death. And then after a few days, you die. Hence the word death. The Black Death left an indelible mark on Europe, everything from religious upheavals to increases in innovation and productivity. Because there were fewer people to do the work, they had to get creative and use machinery to find ways to do the work that used to be done by a whole bunch of people. Luckily, the bubonic plague is all but wiped out today, with fewer than 200 cases a year popping up randomly around the world, and those are actually treated with strong antibiotics, so deaths from bubonic plague is actually quite rare. Number 2, the Spanish flu of 1918. So the influenza virus, chances are you've had it, we've all had it at some point in our lives. It's so common that there's a flu season every year. And it's not uncommon for people to die from the flu. Usually it's older people or younger people or people with compromised immune systems. But the flu pandemic of 1918, that was a whole different animal. This particular strain of flu found its way around the world and infected 500 million people, killing over 100 million people in 1 year. This is considered one of the worst disasters in human history. But the reason you might not have heard much about it is because it took place during World War I, one of the other biggest disasters in human history. Yeah, 1918. Not a great year. Now, it's not actually known where this originated from. It's called the Spanish flu, so a lot of people think that it came from Spain, but the reason it was called Spanish flu was because, again, World War I was going on, and the news reporters and organizations didn't want to lower morale by talking about this horrible flu that was going around, so it kind of got censored in most of the reporting from around the world. But Spain, which was neutral in World War I, reported on it quite a bit, so therefore it looked like Spain was hardest hit by it, but it was actually not any more hit than anybody else. Unluckily for them, the name stuck. But the weird thing about this particular strain of flu is, like I said before, most flus kill older, younger people, immunocompromised people. This one actually mostly killed healthy young people, and it's thought because it caused a cytokine storm in your immune system. So if you had a strong immune system, it actually turned that immune system against your body. So the stronger your immune system, the more likely it was to kill you. Now this is sometimes called the forgotten pandemic because it, again, took place during World War I. That's where everybody's attention was focused. But in terms of sheer numbers, the number of people it killed in such a short amount of time is absolutely mind-blowing. It killed more people in a shorter amount of time than any other disease in human history. And number one, smallpox. Smallpox sucked. Smallpox is caused by the variola virus, and it's been around really since the beginning of our species, and it's just been killing the shit out of people all the way through. It has killed, estimated, over 500 million people. If you get smallpox, there's a 1 in 3 chance that you're gonna die. One of the first recorded plagues was the Plague of Athens in 430 BC, and this was thought to be caused by the smallpox virus. It's also thought to be responsible for the Antonine Plague during 165 to 180 AD, which killed over 7 million people. It ravaged Europe all the way up into the second millennium, but it was when Europeans landed in the Americas that it really got its groove on. In the centuries after Europeans landed in the Americas, nearly 90% of Native American populations were wiped out by not only smallpox, but typhoid and cholera and tuberculosis as well. By the way, I'm going to link to a video right here that CGP Grey did where he talks about why the plague only went from Europe to the Americas and not the other way around. It's actually really fascinating. So victims of smallpox would start things off with fever and headaches and sweating and a rash that eventually turns into pustules all over your body. These pustules manage to do a couple of things. One is spread it to other people very easily and open up your body to infections that came in and wiped you out. This is an old thing, we've talked about this already. Although apparently there was a type of smallpox called sledgehammer smallpox that just caused you to bleed out of all of your sores. Pretty. And it wasn't just poor peasants that were affected. In the 17th and 18th centuries, it killed several reigning European monarchs, including the Habsburg Emperor Joseph I, Queen Mary II of England, Tsar Peter II of Russia, and King Louis XV of France, as well as an Ethiopian king, a Chinese emperor, and 2 Japanese emperors. Turns out no one was immune to smallpox, except milkmaids. In 1796, while smallpox was literally killing off 20% of the European population, a physician named Edward Jenner noticed that milkmaids who had come down with cowpox, which is a much milder form of pox, were immune to smallpox. And he wondered why. So he had this theory that if you could infect somebody with cowpox, they would be inoculated against smallpox. So he tested this out on his gardener's son. He got some pustule pus from a milkmaid that had cowpox and injected it into his arm and gave him a little bit of cowpox. He had a very trusting gardener. Of course, he had to test whether or not the kid was immune to smallpox after the cowpox worked through his system, so he took this kid and exposed him to smallpox over and over again. Who is this gardener? But luckily for the world, and especially for that kid, it worked. He didn't get smallpox, and it proved that getting cowpox could inoculate you against smallpox. So he named it a vaccination. Vacca actually is the Italian word for cow. So once this was proven to work, countries around the world began to mandate smallpox vaccinations to their populations, and it eventually completely wiped out the disease. In 1980, it was declared officially eradicated by the UN. So thanks to technology and vaccinations, the worst killer in all of human history has been contained. Go science. Now there's actually a debate going on today because smallpox only exists in 2 labs around the world, one in Atlanta and one in Moscow. And there are people debating whether or not we should kill those samples and just completely get rid of it altogether, while others say maybe we should hang on to it so that we can test it and be able to deal with it should smallpox ever come back. But then there's always that worry that it could be weaponized. It wouldn't be the first time smallpox was used against populations to kill them off. It was certainly done in the Americas. But how ironic is it that we're talking about weaponizing smallpox, which is exactly how we wiped out the aliens in War of the Worlds. How's that for wrapping things up in a bow? Anyway, fascinating stuff. I'll put some links down in the description for you to go check out and learn more about this. Be glad you live when you do, people. With that, I bid you adieu. Thank you so much for watching. You guys go out and have an eye-opening rest of the week, and I'll see you on Monday. Love you guys. Take care. It's hard to put into words just what a game changer steam locomotives were. For thousands of years, the fastest any human being could travel was on the back of a horse. Maybe a cheetah if you were brave enough. What that means is that traveling outside your local area wasn't really a thing. Just to simply travel to the next town was a multi-day excursion that required a team of people through bandit-infested forest paths. But then humans figured out that if you could harness the energy of turning water into steam, you could move pistons, that could move wheels, that could roll over steel tracks really fast, faster than any human had ever traveled, and for hundreds of miles. Suddenly humans were traveling outside their local villages and seeing new places, hearing new ideas. This didn't always go over well, but it was a really big deal. The steam engines had one fatal flaw, and that was the extremely high pressures and temperatures that they needed to make it work, which that means if things went bad, they went very bad. So bad that they were eventually replaced. But like all technological dead ends, it took one spectacular disaster to really force things to change. And today we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the one disaster that finally ended the steam engine. The Hindenburg of the rails. On May 13th, 1948, in the town of Chillicothe, Ohio, a farmer by the name of Dick Vincent was sitting on his porch when he heard an incredible explosion. An explosion that shook the windows of his house and knocked his wife's sewing machine to the floor. On hearing this, he knew two things. One, it came from the train track, so it was probably a train. And two, another train was due to come by any minute. So he rushed off to the train tracks to find something from a Lovecraftian nightmare that had completely disabled the tracks and threatened to derail the next train coming through. So, thinking quickly, he grabbed some signal flares and he ran a mile up the road to warn the oncoming train. And yeah, he succeeded. The train came to a stop before it reached the explosion, which probably saved dozens of lives. Dick Vincent. Hero. It was only when he got back to the site of the explosion that Dick realized the true scale of the disaster. The locomotive had been blown to kingdom come, replaced by a mess of twisted metal pipes just splayed out like steaming hot tentacles. As he arrived, he saw helpful townspeople swarming the wreckage, a few of them pulling the engineer out of the cab and laying his lifeless body beside the fireman on the side of the tracks, himself bloody and lifeless. In a nearby yard, a doctor attended to the front brakeman, who was blinded by the accident and covered with second-degree burns, his skin bubbling and peeling all over. He would later die at the hospital. The event became known as the boiler explosion of C&O T1 number 3020, which isn't that catchy of a name, but it was fairly consequential. Because it happened at a time when steam train technology was kind of waning as the engine of choice, and it stands as a bit of a dividing line between the steam age and the diesel age. What happened that fateful day in 1948 was unfortunately a far too common experience. I wouldn't say explosions happened all the time, but they were pretty common. To understand why, it kind of helps to know exactly how these steam locomotives work, so I'll give this quick and dirty explainer. Steam locomotive works by boiling water and then using the increased steam pressure to power pistons. Simple enough. So to see how this works in a locomotive, you can divide it into three parts: the firebox, the boiler, and the smoke box. The firebox is where they burn the fuel for the heat, often being coal, sometimes wood, later on oil. The boiler is basically a large cylindrical water tank turned on its side and filled with water. And the smoke box is where the exhaust from the fire is collected and vented out. Now, you may be wondering why the exhaust is on the other side of the water tank. Well, that's because there's a series of dozens of pipes that pass through the boiler from the firebox to the smoke box, and they carry all that heat from the firebox with it. That, of course, heats the pipes, which heats the water and causes it to boil. The steam in the top of the boiler builds up pressure, and then it collects in the steam dome where it gets piped down to the pistons. Now that's a very simplified version. They were able to get more energy out of the boiler by including superheaters, which direct the steam back through the boiler with dozens, even hundreds of smaller pipes that help heat the water even more and get even more pressure. So in a steam engine, you're constantly monitoring the water level in the boiler and adding just the right amount when needed. You have to monitor the fuel to keep the heat at an even temperature, and of course, accelerating and decelerating are done by manipulating those inputs. So these boilers had to be at extremely high pressures to work, up to 300 psi, which, by the way, also pressurized the water, and the higher the water pressure, the higher the boiling point, so the water in the boiler could get over 400 degrees Fahrenheit before it even boiled. So yeah, when things went wrong on steam engines, they went very, very wrong. The explosion in Chillicothe likely happened because the water in the boiler fell too low during a hill climb. Chillicothe sat on a bit of a plateau, so the train had a slight uphill climb as it approached town, enough to make the water in the boiler slosh back, leaving the pipes exposed. Oh, I should point out that some train crews would actually run the boilers kind of low because that would create more steam faster. Kind of like if you're running an electric tea kettle, like it boils a lot faster if you only have one cup in it than if you have four. And yeah, they think that the crew may have been doing that on the 3020 that day, and then when the water sloshed backwards, the pipes overheated. And then the crew added too much water too quickly, which superheated the bare pipes, and then it just explosively flashed into steam. By the way, that metal was already weak from being superheated, so the extra pressure when it hit it just, yeah, it didn't have a chance. So yeah, when the boiler exploded, all those hundreds of tubes in the boiler just splayed out, creating this crazy Cthulhu effect. So the Chillicothe accident was horrible, but it wasn't all that rare. Wikipedia records 53 boiler explosions in locomotives, claiming a total of 155 lives. The earliest recorded incident happened in 1815 when 16 people were killed. The last incident was in the 1995 explosion of a Gettysburg tourist train, which thankfully didn't kill anyone, but it badly burnt the engineer. 1995 is a bit of an outlier, really. 1977 really was the last boiler explosion from a commercial steam train, so we should probably stop counting there. So 53 explosions between 1815 and 1977 comes out to about 1 every 3 years, with an average death toll of 3 people, which makes sense because it takes 3 people to run it. Although the highest death toll was 26 people. It happened in 1912 in the San Antonio rail yard. There was a strike going on at the time, and it's thought that maybe a railway employee may have sabotaged the locomotive by messing with the safety valves, which caused a buildup of pressure. Yeah, this explosion was a monster, and it happened in a densely populated area, so the damage was extra bad. All the buildings and equipment within 100 feet were demolished, and among the 26 killed were several people who were trapped inside nearby buildings. In fact, one of the victims was a woman named B.S. Gillis, and she died when the locomotive's front end fell through her roof and crushed her. She was 7 blocks away. So was that it? Is that what killed the steam engine? It was too deadly? Well, I mean, clearly things can go very wrong, but 155 deaths is just a drop in the bucket compared to the thousands who died from derailments and collisions and other locomotive disasters. And if you want to keep going with it, those thousands are nothing compared to the 83,000 plus deaths on airplanes since 1970. And we consider that to be the safest form of transportation. Of course, like, proportionally it is. By the way, maritime deaths make both trains and planes sound reasonable. And of course, all other forms of transportation just pale in comparison to the 1.9 million people who die in car accidents every year. Seriously, I'm surprised anybody ever leaves home. So it wasn't like an unnecessarily high body count that doomed the steam engine, and it wasn't performance that did it in, because actually steam engines were more powerful than the diesel engines that replaced it. I mean, it's kind of like how Beta actually had a better video quality than VHS, but it still lost the video format war. There are other things at play here. So to start with, by the 1950s, steam engine technology was about as good as it was ever going to get. And look, to be fair, when you really dig into how these engines work, they were kind of marvels of mechanical engineering. But the internal combustion engine was still on the rise, and they had taken over all the roads and the automobiles and trucks, and the petroleum industry was big and powerful and everywhere by that point. Also, diesel was cheap, and it only took 1 driver instead of 3, which also saved money. And it was easier to transport. Yeah, I didn't even talk about this earlier, but part of the locomotive design was the tender cab that was pulled behind the locomotive, which carried both water and coal to fuel it along the way, whereas a diesel locomotive just needed a fuel car filled with diesel. It was also cleaner, believe it or not. It didn't billow out giant clouds of steam and smoke from burning coal, and there were no giant ash pans to clean out. So it was mostly the economics of it and the simplicity of it, but also, I think it's fair to point out, no diesel engine explosions look like this. So is it fair to call the Chillicothe explosion the Hindenburg of rail? No, the Chillicothe explosion wasn't the most consequential boiler explosion in history, but the Hindenburg wasn't the deadliest airship disaster either. It was just the most seen. The Hindenburg disaster was caught on film and played in newsreels all around the country, causing a wave of nopes as far as the eye could see. And this photo has some big nope energy. And it wasn't the only one. There's actually a lot of boiler explosion photos out there, and they all kind of make me not want to get near one. So, I mean, in the same way that the Hindenburg footage was the final nail in the coffin for airships, this photo was at least one of the final nails for steam trains. Still, steam hasn't gone away completely. Tourist trains are still in operation, though under stricter guidelines than in 1995. Internationally, some farms and factories still make use of steam trains. As of 2011 at least, sugar plantations in Java were making use of steam trains to transport their product from the field, and they also charge tourists to ride along. Some enthusiasts are even looking to build next-generation steam technology for modern use. One early effort was the 5AT Advanced Technology steam locomotive. It was proposed in 1998, studies were conducted all the way up to 2012, but they were never able to really secure any real financial backing for it, so it just kind of never went anywhere. Concepts for a solar-powered steam engine also exist. One was proposed for testing in Sacramento, but as far as I could find, nothing really came of it. But I did manage to locate a paper out of 2022 from the University of Michigan discussing the viability of a 1/8 scale solar steam train. Both of the Sacramento and the U Michigan designs were meant to be fireless, meaning they'd either use stored steam or generate steam with fireless heat. According to the U Michigan paper, a solar steam engine would have all the environmental advantages of conventional solar, meaning no CO2 or nitrous oxide emissions. Which sounds cool, but, you know, considering the solar electric train's already a thing, it doesn't really seem like we'll be adding steam to the mix anytime soon. Not at full scale anyway. But I think that's it for today. You guys go out there, have an eye-opening rest of the week. Stay safe, and I'll see you next time. Love you guys. Take care. All right, so that was another long one. If you guys stuck around to the very end of this one, you are insane, and I love you. Let's see, so there's been bananas and apples. How about cherries? Fruit salad. If you have watched the end of this video, comment with a cherry. Also, tell me what you've been doing while you've been watching this whole thing, cleaning your house or whatever it is you do. But anyway, there's going to be a few more of these compilations as we go through the summer. It's going to be a kind of a crazy summer, but we got a lot of new stuff coming. All the things, you know, I appreciate you guys. So I hope you enjoyed this. Keep an eye out for the next one, and I'll see you next time. Love you guys. Take care.